Thank you for joining in today's cryptid horror stories. The first story today is called The Hunger That Whispers, and this is a horror story about the Wendigo. And in this story, a group of 6 urban explorers and historians venture into the remote boreal forests of Ontario during a record-breaking winter. Their goal is to find a lost settlement from the 1800s that vanished during a famine. The group is led by a man obsessed with the folklore of the region. They aren't just tourists. They are searching for a specific journal that allegedly details how to quiet the hunger of the woods. The second story today is called The Frozen Heart, and this is a horror story about the Chenoo. And in this story, a small group of geological researchers and guides are stationed at a remote, high-altitude research station in the Maine wilderness during a record-breaking polar vortex. The atmosphere is tense. Resources are dwindling due to a supply chain collapse caused by the storms. The head guide, an indigenous man, warns the team about the Chenoo, not as a myth, but as a biological reality of the region, a warning that the hunger of the winter can turn a man into something else. In the description below, the stories have been timestamped. Also, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button so you don't miss the stories yet to come. Now for today's cryptid horror stories, I hope you all enjoy. The Hunger That Whispers. The dinner party was a masterpiece of civility. There were 7 guests seated around the long oak table, draped in ivory linen that cascaded to the floor in crisp, surgical folds. Candles in silver holders threw warm amber light across the china, the good china, with the thin gold rim you only bring out when the occasion demands a particular kind of beauty. The wine was a Pomerol, decanted and breathing, its surface catching the candlelight with the dark, glassy sheen of something that was almost black. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the warmth of it pressed through the air like a living hand, softening every shadow. The guests were laughing, the particular kind of laughter that comes from people who are comfortable with each other, who have shared enough meals and enough wine that the laughter has become a language of its own, a dialect of warmth and belonging that needs no words. A woman in emerald silk was describing, with theatrical hand gestures, a disastrous trip to Florence. Her rings flashed in the candlelight, and her voice rose and fell with the practiced cadence of someone who has told this story before and knows exactly where the laughs are. The man beside her, broad-shouldered and silver-haired, was wiping tears of mirth from his eyes with a linen napkin. Across the table, a younger couple, the woman pregnant, her hand resting on the swell of her belly, were sharing a quiet, private smile that excluded the rest of the table in the gentle, unintentional way that lovers have of building a room within a room. The host was standing at the head of the table, carving. He was a tall man, distinguished, with silver temples and a waistcoat the color of dried blood, and he wielded the carving knife with the unhurried confidence of a surgeon. The roast sat on a silver platter before him, a great glistening mound of protein that steamed gently in the candlelight, its surface crackled and browned, glistening with rendered fat. He sliced, and the knife moved through the meat with a slow, wet, yielding sound, the sound of something giving way, and the slices fell away in thick, pink-tinged slabs that he arranged on plates with sprigs of rosemary and tiny, roasted potatoes. The narrator was beneath the table. From this vantage point, the dinner party was a different country. The world was reduced to its lowest common denominators, the underside of the table, the forest of chair legs, the shoes. There were 14 shoes down here, loafers and heels and brogues, and 1 pair of velvet slippers with little gold monograms on the toes. The pregnant woman had kicked off her shoes, and her bare feet rested on the base of her chair, the toes curling and uncurling in slow, unconscious rhythm, the skin pink and soft and vulnerable in the dim light. The smell should have been wonderful down here, the warm, layered fragrance of a feast, roasted meat, and rendered fat and garlic and rosemary and red wine. It was not wonderful. There was something wrong with the meat. The narrator could smell it, not the surface smell, the garlic and the rosemary and the fat, which were all performing their roles in the olfactory theater of a dinner party, but the underlying smell, the smell of the protein itself. It smelled of something that had been preserved, not cooked. A sharp, sweet, institutional smell that belonged not to kitchens but to laboratories, not to dining rooms but to places where the dead were kept. Formaldehyde. The meat smelled of formaldehyde. And the meat itself was wrong. A slice had fallen from the platter during the carving, a thick, irregular slab that tumbled to the floor and came to rest 6 inches from the narrator's hand. In the dim light beneath the table, the meat was not the pinkish brown of roasted flesh. It was gray. A deep, wet, saturated gray. The gray of things submerged in cold water for a long time. The gray of tissue that has been preserved until the preservation itself has become the primary characteristic of the material. The narrator reached for the slice, picked it up. It was cold. Not room temperature cold, but morgue cold, the kind that has no business being near a fire or a room full of living, laughing people. The texture was fibrous, but the fibers ran in the wrong direction. They tangled and crossed in a pattern that was not the pattern of any muscle the narrator had ever encountered. These fibers had been laid down not by the natural growth of a living body, but by something that had assembled the tissue rather than grown it. Something that had built this meat the way a bricklayer builds a wall, without regard for the architecture of the original design. The narrator held the gray meat in one hand and looked at the shoes, 14 of them arranged around the table, and they thought, with a clarity sharper than the candlelight and colder than the meat, "This is not meat. This is something else, and these people are eating it. And the laughter is the same as the meat, performed, assembled, built from components that do not belong together." And then the dinner party came apart. It did not shatter. It did not collapse. It came apart the way a reflection comes apart when you throw a stone into still water, the image distorting, fragmenting, the pieces drifting away from each other with a slow, liquid grace that was almost beautiful, because the original image had been a lie and the distortion was the truth. The ivory linen turned white and then turned to snow. The candlelight was replaced by a different light, a flat, directionless, sourceless gray that had no warmth and no shadows. The fire in the hearth dissolved into the gray sky. The china became ice. The wine became something dark and cold and viscous that smelled of copper and frost. The laughter became wind. The voices became the high, keening whistle of air through bare branches. The shoes were gone, vanished, as if the feet had been the first things to dissolve, the first things to return to the truth. The narrator was not beneath a table. The narrator was lying in a snowdrift, curled on their side, their cheek pressed against a crust of ice so cold it burned. The parka they wore was stiff with frozen condensation. Their gloves were crusted with something dark, blood, old blood that had frozen and thawed and refrozen until it had become a permanent stain. Their breath came in shallow, ragged gasps that crystallized the instant they left the mouth, each exhalation a small, transient ghost that formed and dissolved in the air above their face. They were holding something in their right hand. They had been holding it for so long that the fingers had locked around it, the tendons frozen in a rictus grip that would require warmth to release. The object was small, hard, cold in a way that was different from the cold of the air, a more deliberate cold, a personal cold, the cold of something that had been removed from a living body and was now alone in the world, separated from the warmth that had once sustained it. The narrator opened their hand. The fingers resisted, cracking, creaking, the sound of ice fracturing in a glass, but they opened, and the object lay in the palm of the glove, dark against the dark fabric. A finger, a human finger, severed at the second joint. The skin was the color of candle wax, pale, waxy, translucent, and the nail was intact, painted a deep, dark burgundy that caught the flat gray light and fractured it into dark red shards, the way wine catches candlelight in a crystal glass. The narrator stared at the finger. They did not scream. They did not cry. They lay in the snowdrift and stared at the severed finger in their hand and felt the hunger. The hunger was not in the stomach. It had gone beyond the stomach, beyond the intestines, beyond the body's machinery of digestion. The hunger was in the bones, in the blood, in the space between the cells, in the cerebrospinal fluid that cushions the brain. The hunger was everywhere. It was not an absence of food. It was a presence of something else, something that had moved into the space where satiety should have been and had made itself at home and settled in for a long stay. And the hunger whispered, not in words, not in a voice, in a pressure, a direction, a pull like gravity but inward, as though the center of the earth had relocated to the center of the narrator's chest, and everything, every cell, every molecule, every atom was falling inward, toward a point that could never be reached, toward an emptiness that could never be filled. The whisper said, "Eat." The whisper said, "Eat." The whisper said, "Eat." And the narrator looked at the finger in their hand and understood, with the terrible, crystalline clarity that comes only with extreme starvation, that the finger was not a horror. The finger was food. And the only thing standing between the narrator and the finger was the thin, fraying, almost gone thread of what it meant to be human. 6 weeks earlier, the expedition had begun with a kind of cautious, professional optimism that was worse than naivety because it should have known better. The 6 of them had gathered in a rented commercial space on the outskirts of Thunder Bay, a corrugated steel warehouse that smelled of motor oil and cold concrete, with a loading dock that faced north toward a sky the color of wet cement. The wind that came through the gaps in the dock doors was not a breeze. It was a living force, a breathing entity that pushed and pulled and tested the building the way a predator tests a fence, looking for weakness, looking for gaps, looking for the one loose board that would let it in. Andrew Hartwell stood at the head of a folding table that was buried under topographic maps, archival photocopies, equipment lists, and the particular kind of organized chaos that happens when 6 people's worth of specialized gear is assembled in one place. He was 43, tall but not imposing, with the lean, slightly hollow look of a man who burns calories not through physical exertion, but through the relentless, internal combustion of obsession. His face had once been handsome. The bone structure was still there, the strong jaw, the deep-set eyes. But the obsession had eaten the handsomeness from the inside, the way a parasite eats its host, leaving behind a shell that was technically intact but fundamentally altered. His eyes were the most altered part. They were pale blue, almost colorless, and they burned with a steady, unwavering intensity that was not the intensity of intelligence or passion but of something else, something that fed, something that consumed, something that was never satisfied. He had a tremor in his hands. It had been there for years. He did not try to hide it or control it. It was, he had once told a colleague, the price of caring too much about something that no one else cared about at all. The settlement was established in 1847, Andrew said, tracing a line on the topographic map with a trembling finger. 37 settlers, families mostly, with a few single men, traveled north from York into the boreal forest to establish a logging and trapping community. They were guided by a Métis man named Joseph Marchand, who had told them about a valley with abundant game, clean water, and soil that could support root vegetables. An ideal settlement. A promised land. He paused, looked up. The 2 bright eyes swept the room. They were never seen again. The statement was delivered without drama. Andrew did not have a dramatic bone in his body. The drama was in the facts themselves, and Andrew's role was simply to present them, the way a coroner presents a cause of death, clinical, precise, and devastating in its simplicity. Anita Voss was leaning against the far wall, arms crossed, watching Andrew with an expression that could have been skepticism or could have been something more complicated. She was 38, compact and dense, built the way a machine tool is built, every component serving a function, nothing decorative, nothing wasted. She had the weathered, wind-carved face of someone who had spent more of her life outdoors than in, and her dark hair was cropped close to the skull in a cut that was not about style but about practicality. Hair gets in the way, hair freezes. Hair is a liability in the cold. Her hands, resting on her crossed forearms, were a map of her history, a constellation of scars, burn marks, frostbite traces, the orthopedic record of a life spent in proximity to things that hurt. She had spent 12 years as a wilderness survival instructor and 6 more as a search and rescue volunteer. She had pulled people out of avalanches, out of crevasses, out of the water when the water was 2 degrees above freezing, and the person had been in it for 11 minutes and was technically dead, and Anita had breathed life back into them with her own mouth. She was not a woman who was easily frightened. She was, however, a woman who was easily annoyed, and Andrew Hartwell was annoying her. "People vanish in the bush, Andrew," she said. Her voice was flat, clipped, efficient. "Every year. Frostbite, exposure, hypothermia. A bad winter up here kills experienced trappers. A bad winter kills people who grew up in the bush. 37 settlers from York in 1847. They probably lasted 3 months. Starvation, yes," Andrew said. "That's the conventional explanation. That's what the historians say. That's what the official record says. But that's not what happened." He reached into the stack of documents and produced a photocopy. The copy was poor. The toner was smudged, the paper was yellowed, and the handwriting, reproduced in faded gray on gray, was cramped and angular and hard to read. But Anita could make out enough. The entry was dated. The writer identified himself as Thomas Grier, the settlement's self-appointed chronicler. "March 3rd, 1848, Andrew read. "The cold has not broken. We have eaten the last of the salted pork and the dried beans. Joseph has been gone 4 days. The children cry from hunger, and their crying has become a sound I cannot distinguish from the wind." He turned the page. The handwriting on the second page was different, wilder, less controlled, the letters leaning at angles that suggested a hand being written by a mind that was beginning to lose its grip on the conventions of communication. "Joseph returned last night, or something wearing Joseph's face returned last night. He would not come into the light of the fire. He stood at the edge of the clearing and called to us, but his voice was wrong. The pitch was too high. The words came at the wrong speed, and beneath the words, there was another sound, the sound of chewing, the sound of something eating while it spoke." The room was quiet. The wind outside pressed against the loading dock doors with a sound like a hand sliding across a surface, testing, probing. "That's a journal entry from 1848, Andrew said. "Found in 1923 by a government surveyor named Edgar Pelletier, who stumbled onto the site of the settlement while mapping the region. Pelletier described what he found. Not a ruin, not a town, not a collection of buildings. A series of pits and lean-tos, arranged in a circle around a central clearing. In the center of the clearing, a stone-lined pit filled with ash and bones." He paused. The tremor in his hands migrated to his voice. "Human bones, but not clean bones. Not bones that had been boiled for marrow or cracked for the fat. Bones that had been gnawed. And the teeth marks, Pelletier said, were too large for any animal in the region. Too large for a bear. Too large for a wolf." Anita stared at the photocopy in Andrew's hands. She stared at it with the expression of someone who is being told something that is either a lie or a horror, and is trying to determine which. "So you want to take 6 people into the bush in the middle of the worst winter, in a decade to look for a monster," she said. "I want to find the rest of the journal," Andrew said. "Grier's entries, the pages Pelletier took, are incomplete. The rest, Pelletier said, were scattered throughout the site, some in the pits, some nailed to trees, and there's something else." He produced another document, this one an original, a single page of yellowed, brittle paper covered in handwriting that was more controlled than Grier's but no less disturbing. "This is from a Jesuit missionary's collection, dated approximately 1690. It describes a ritual for quieting the hunger of the woods. The ritual involves burning specific substances and reciting words in a language the missionary couldn't identify. The text says that if the ritual is performed correctly, The thing that feeds will sleep, and the hunger will pass from the land. He looked around the room, his eyes burned. I want to find the rest of Grier's journal. I want to find the complete ritual, and I want to understand what happened to those people, because it's happening again. He produced a newspaper clipping. The headline, "Remote Hunting Party Vanishes in Wabakimi Wilderness, Search Called Off." 4 hunters 18 months ago, experienced men, GPS, satellite phones, emergency beacons. None of it worked. Their bodies were never found. The search team reported that the area was unusually quiet and that their GPS equipment malfunctioned. The room was silent except for the wind. Marcus Chen broke the silence. He was 31, a wildlife biologist from the University of Toronto, tall and precise. With round, wire-framed glasses he adjusted constantly, a tic that betrayed the anxiety running beneath his composed exterior. He had joined because Andrew had promised access to a potentially pristine example of pre-industrial boreal forest ecology. "I've read the folklore, Andrew," Marcus said, his voice measured and academic. "The Wendigo, a spirit of starvation and cannibalism, rooted in the Algonquian-speaking cultures of the northern forests. A human being who, in the grip of desperate hunger, turns to cannibalism and is transformed into a monstrous creature with an insatiable appetite. It's a powerful cultural narrative, a manifestation of the taboo against cannibalism. But it's a story, an explanatory framework, not a biological phenomenon." Andrew looked at Marcus with an expression of patient, predatory attention. "I know what the folklore says, Marcus. I've spent 12 years studying it. I'm not claiming there's a supernatural monster in the woods. I'm claiming that something happened to those 37 people, and the folklore is the closest thing we have to an explanation. The journal describes a creature that mimicked human voices. The surveyor described a cooking pit with gnawed human bones and teeth, marks too large for any known animal. And the ritual text suggests that someone, probably the Algonquin people who lived in this region long before the settlers, knew about this thing and had a method for dealing with it. I want to find that method. And if you find it, then what? Then we have an answer. Then we have a way to make it stop." The group was rounded out by 3 others. David Okafor, 40, a historian from McGill specializing in the social dynamics of isolated colonial settlements. He was a large man, broad, deep-chested, with a voice like a bass drum played softly, and he had the careful, deliberative manner of someone who treated every assertion as a hypothesis to be tested. He had a beard he stroked when thinking, which was always. He had joined because the historical significance of a lost 1840s settlement was, in his words, off the charts. Renee Bouchard, 29, a photojournalist who had built her career documenting the forgotten places of Canada, abandoned residential schools, derelict mining towns, the empty interiors of buildings that had once been full of people and were now full of nothing. She was small, wiry, with close-cropped hair dyed an electric shade of violet, and a camera she handled with the tenderness of someone cradling a child. She had joined because the chance to photograph a lost settlement was irresistible, and because she did not believe in monsters, and because not believing in monsters had never stopped her from wanting to see the places where monsters were supposed to live. And Alina Vasquez, 35, a paramedic and wilderness first aid specialist who had worked 11 search and rescue missions and had seen things she would not discuss, even under duress, even when the whiskey was flowing and the stories people told were the kind that are only told at night. She had the calm, unshakable presence of someone who had learned that panic is a luxury that costs lives, and she carried a medical kit that could handle everything from hypothermia to compound fractures. She had joined because someone had told her, in the careful, measured tones people use when they are trying to sound casual about something that is not casual, that the last team that went into the Wabakimi wilderness had not come back. And Alina, who had spent her career going to the places where people had not come back from, had felt the pull of the unfinished, the pull of the unresolved, the pull that is not curiosity but duty. 6 people, one obsession, a valley in the boreal forest that had been swallowing people for nearly 2 centuries, and a winter that was already in November breaking records. The drive north from Thunder Bay consumed 8 hours and most of the daylight. The road was paved for the first 2 hours, then gravel, then a rutted logging track that the rental SUVs protested with increasing desperation. The landscape transformed in distinct, perceptible steps, like descending a staircase. The deciduous trees thinned and disappeared, replaced by black spruce and jack pine, their dark silhouettes standing against the gray sky like sentinels, like the standing dead. The lakes they passed were frozen, their surfaces opaque and dark, like cataracts over the eyes of something blind. Anita rode in the lead vehicle with Andrew. She watched the dashboard thermometer with the professional attention of someone reading a patient's vitals. -5, -8, -12, -15. Each degree was a step deeper into territory where the margin for error shrank and the consequences of mistakes grew. Environment Canada is calling for sustained lows of -30 to -40 in the interior, she said. Wind chill to -50. We should be discussing whether we go at all, Andrew, not what we do when we get there. Andrew's eyes did not leave the road. We go. -50 wind chill kills people, experienced people. We go. Anita stared at him. The tremor in his hands was visible even through his gloves. His jaw was set so tight that the tendons in his neck stood out like cables, and his breathing was shallow and rapid, the breathing of a man running on something other than oxygen, something internal, something that consumed rather than sustained. She had seen this before, in climbers fixated on a summit, in prospectors convinced that the next bend in the river would reveal gold, in people who had crossed the line between dedication and compulsion and had no interest in finding their way back. She should have turned the car around. She should have told the others. She should have done many things. She would know this then, and she would know it forever after, and the knowing would be permanent, a scar on the tissue of her memory that would never fade. Instead, she checked the thermometer, -18, falling. They left the vehicles where the logging road dissolved into a barely discernible footpath marked with faded orange flagging tape that Andrew had placed during a preliminary hike 3 months earlier. The tape was torn and in places missing entirely. Each person carried a 60-liter backpack with a base weight of approximately 30 pounds, plus food, fuel, and shared gear. Anita had distributed the loads with the precision of a military quartermaster. She carried the emergency shelter and the satellite phone. Andrew carried the historical documents and the GPS unit. Marcus carried wildlife monitoring equipment. David carried excavation tools. Renee carried her camera gear. Alina carried the medical kit and supplementary rations. The hike to the settlement was estimated at 3 days through terrain that made the estimate feel optimistic. The ground rolled in long, forested swells broken by ravines and muskeg that swallowed their boots with every step. The snow was knee-deep in the open and waist-deep in the drifts, and the cold was not a condition but a presence, a thing that pressed against every exposed surface of skin and crept through every layer of clothing to find the warmth beneath and draw it out, slowly, patiently, the way a leech draws blood. They made camp on the first night in a depression between 2 granite outcroppings. The tents were 4-season mountaineering shelters. The sleeping bags were rated to -40. They ate freeze-dried meals heated on small butane stoves and drank water melted from snow, which tasted of nothing, of emptiness, of a landscape stripped of everything except cold and silence. Marcus, who had been monitoring wildlife throughout the hike, made a note in his field journal that he would later wish he had studied more carefully. Day 1, no wildlife observed, no tracks, no scat, no bird calls, no insect activity expected given the temperature, but the completeness of the absence is unusual. The forest is not dormant, it is empty, Dormancy is a state of suspension, life waiting, life paused. This is not that. This is the silence of removal, of something having been here and taken everything with it when it left. The silence has a texture. It is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that has consumed sound, the way a fire consumes oxygen. He read the note aloud to David, who was sharing his tent. David, already half asleep, murmured something about anthropomorphizing the landscape and rolled over. Marcus lay awake, listening to the silence, which was not silence at all but a low, continuous subsonic hum that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere. The sound of a refrigerator in an empty house, a sound so constant and so low that it becomes audible only when you notice it. And once you notice it, you cannot unnotice it, and it follows you into sleep like a whisper through a wall. The second day was worse. The temperature had dropped overnight to -28, and the wind had intensified into gusts that screamed through the treetops and drove the snow horizontally, reducing visibility to 30 meters or less. They traveled in a line, Anita in the lead, breaking trail, each person following the bobbing outline of the pack in front of them like a diver following a guideline through murky water. The landscape was changing, not the way wilderness terrain naturally changes, gradually, organically, but in a way that felt deliberate, as though the forest were rearranging itself around them, closing in, thickening. The trees grew denser, their trunks pressed closer together, their branches interlocking overhead to form a canopy so thick that the gray light filtering through was reduced to a dim, subterranean glow. The snow was deeper here, and it had a quality that Anita did not like. She stopped, knelt, scooped up a handful and held it close to her face. The snow was gray, not the natural gray of old snow, which is the gray of dirt and pollution and time, but a deeper, stranger gray, a gray that seemed to come from within the snow itself, as though the snow had absorbed something from the ground beneath it, something that had bled upward through the ice and stained the white with a color that was the color of ash, of cinder, of things that had been burned and reduced to their most elemental, colorless residue. "Andrew," she said into the wind, "come here." He trudged back, his face raw and wind-burned beneath his balaclava. He knelt beside her, looked at the gray snow, and something ignited behind his two bright eyes. "Ash," he said, "ash-colored snow." Pelletier described this. He said the clearing was surrounded by ash-colored snow, as though the ground itself had been burned. Burned snow, in a forest at -28 degrees. "I know what it sounds like. It sounds like something that should not exist." Andrew's eyes burned. "That's why we're here." They pressed on. The forest grew denser and older, the trees blackened and cracked, their bark split by deep fissures that exposed the wood beneath, wood that was not the pale, healthy cream of living timber but a dark, charred brown, as though the trees had been exposed to enormous heat at some point in their long history. The ground sloped downward, gently at first, then more steeply, and the snow deepened until they were wading through drifts that reached their waists. And then, without warning, the trees opened. They emerged into a clearing roughly 50 meters in diameter, roughly circular, surrounded by a wall of blackened spruce and pine so dense it was nearly opaque. The clearing was flat. The snow was unbroken except for a series of depressions, pits, Anita realized, reading the pattern of snow-covered mounds, that were arranged in a circle around the perimeter, with a larger depression at the center. The ash-colored snow covered everything. The entire clearing was dusted with it, giving the scene the appearance of a landscape rendered in black and white and gray, drained of all color, all warmth, all life. The sky above was a flat, featureless gray, and the light that fell through it was the color of old bone. David stopped at the edge of the clearing and stared. His historian's eye was already working, reading the layout, the arrangement, the spatial logic of the site. "This is it," he said. His voice was hushed, reverent. "The pits are the foundations dug into the permafrost, lined with stone and timber covered with branches and hides. This is exactly what Pelletier described. Wabikimi, the lost settlement. The village that was never lost, Andrew said. It was right here, waiting. They set up camp in the clearing, pitching their tents between the mounds, using the depressions as windbreaks. The work was slow and brutal in the cold, fingers numb, metal buckles burning against bare skin, tent fabric stiff and uncooperative. But they got the camp established, and by the time the gray twilight was deepening into the absolute blackness of a boreal winter night, they were sheltered, fed, and as warm as the conditions allowed. That night, around the small butane stove in the communal cooking tent, Andrew spread out the documents and began cross-referencing them with the site. The pits correspond to the layout in Grier's journal, he said, his eyes flicking between the pages and the clearing outside. 16 dwellings arranged in a circle. The central pit was the communal hearth, the cooking pit Pelletier described. The north mound would have been food storage. The south entrance faced the creek. And the journal, David asked. You said there were more pages. Scattered according to Pelletier, some in the dwellings, some nailed to trees. He only took a few pages because he was low on supplies and the weather was turning. And the ritual? Elena asked. She was wrapping a bandage around her own wrist which she had tweaked during the afternoon's work. Her voice was calm and clinical. What exactly are we looking for? A specific page, Andrew said. The missionary's text describes the ritual in fragments, but Grier's journal appears to contain a more complete version. If anyone recorded the full ritual, it was him. And then what? Anita asked from the doorway of the tent, where she stood watching the darkness outside. We find the ritual, we perform it, and the hunger goes away. Is that the plan? Andrew looked at her. That's the plan. That's not a plan, that's a fairy tale. Every plan starts as a fairy tale, until someone makes it real. Anita stared at him. The tremor in his hands was worse tonight. She could see it in the way he held the documents, the pages vibrating, and his eyes had a new quality in the dim light of the tent, a glassiness, a hunger. She turned back to the darkness and said nothing. The first night in the clearing was quiet, too quiet. Anita, who had spent hundreds of nights in the wilderness, knew the sounds of the boreal forest at night, the hooting of owls, the distant howling of wolves, the creak and groan of trees under the weight of snow and wind. These sounds were not comforting exactly, but they were familiar. They were the sounds of a living landscape. The clearing had none of these sounds. The silence was absolute, not the relative silence of a quiet night, where you can still hear the whisper of wind and the settling of snow, but a total silence, a vacuum, a negative space that pressed against the eardrums like water. Anita lay in her sleeping bag and listened to the nothing and felt it pressing against her. And she thought, for the first time but not the last, that the silence was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that consumed sound, something that ate noise the way a fire eats oxygen, drawing it in and converting it to nothing. She did not sleep. She lay awake and watched her breath crystallize in the air inside the tent, each exhalation a small, temporary ghost that formed and dissolved, a rhythm as steady and meaningless as a heartbeat in an empty chest. Morning came without dawn. The sky lightened from black to gray, from gray to a lighter gray, and then the day was simply there, flat and colorless, as though someone had turned on a light in a room with no windows. The temperature had dropped further overnight. Anita's thermometer, zipped into an inner pocket of her sleeping bag, read -34. The cold had a new quality, a sharpness, an aggressiveness, as though it were no longer a condition but a force, an entity, something with intent. They searched the site. The work was grueling, digging through frozen snow and permafrost, excavating the pits with pickaxes and shovels, cataloging every artifact with the care of a formal archaeological dig. David oversaw the excavation, directing the work with the methodical calm of a man who had spent his career unearthing the remains of human habitation. What they found in the pits was disturbing. The lean-tos had been crude but functional timber frames, insulated with moss and hide, with sleeping platforms raised above the frozen ground. The cooking implements were present: iron pots, wooden ladles, knives with handles worn smooth by use, but the pots contained residue that was not food. Marcus scraped samples and examined them under a portable field microscope. "Protein residue," he said, his voice carefully neutral. He adjusted his glasses. "Animal protein, but the structure is degraded. I can't identify the source." A pause. "There's also evidence of bone fragments, small ones, phalanges, I think." The silence that followed was a human silence. The silence of 6 people processing the same information and arriving at the same conclusion and choosing, each of them, not to say it aloud. Renee was the one who broke it. "They were cooking people," she said. Her camera hung at her side, forgotten. "They ran out of food and they started cooking people." "Or something cooked them," Andrew said. No one responded to that. They found the first journal pages in the 3rd pit they excavated. The pages were brittle, water-damaged, in some cases frozen into the permafrost so solidly that they had to be chipped free with a knife. But the handwriting was unmistakable: Thomas Grier's cramped, angular script, and the content made the earlier entries seem like children's stories. January 14, 1848. "We have eaten the last of the dried fish. The children no longer cry. I do not know if this is because they have accepted their fate or because they have gone beyond hunger into some other state. Little James, Margaret's youngest, only 4 years old, has not moved in 2 days. He breathes, but his eyes are open and they do not see." January 19th. "Joseph has not returned, but last night in the deepest part of the dark we heard his voice from the trees. He was calling to us. 'Come out,' he said. 'I have found food. There is a deer, a great fat deer, and I cannot carry it alone. Come and help me.' His voice was warm. It was the warmest thing I have heard in weeks. But William took me by the arm and said, 'Do not go, that is not Joseph. Listen to the voice. Listen carefully.' And I listened and I heard what William heard. The voice was Joseph's, but the rhythm was wrong. The pauses came in the wrong places, and underneath the words there was another sound, a sound like chewing, a sound like something eating while it spoke." January 23rd. "William went last night. He went to the voice. In the morning we found his boots by the entrance to his shelter, his boots and nothing else, and in the snow outside there was a footprint, a single footprint larger than a man's, with claws that had dug into the frost. The footprint was alone. There was no second footprint. Whatever made it walked on one leg or flew, and the thought of either makes me want to scream, but I cannot scream because screaming requires energy, and energy requires food, and we have no food, and so I write instead." David, reading over Andrew's shoulder, had gone pale beneath his beard. "He's describing the stages of the folklore," he said. "The starvation, the voice, the creature mimicking human voices to lure people out, the disappearance, the single footprint. It's a textbook account of the Wendigo narrative." "Except textbooks don't have footprints that walk on one leg," Marcus said quietly. Anita stepped back into the tent. Her face was raw from the cold, the skin across her cheekbones stretched tight, and her eyes had the flat, controlled look of someone who is assessing a situation and finding it worse than expected. "We need to talk about leaving," she said. Andrew didn't look up from the journal pages. "We just got here." "Andrew, the temperature is -34 and dropping. We're 4 days' hike from the vehicles. Our supplies are rated for 10 days and we've used 2. If the weather turns, and it will, we could be stranded here. This isn't a library. This is a place that kills people." "The journal." "The journal has been here for 178 years. It will survive another 3 months." Andrew looked up, his eyes burned. "You don't understand. The journal won't be here in the spring. The pages are in the trees, nailed to the trees. Paper nailed to trees in a boreal forest over a winter gets eaten by moisture, by insects, by the wind. Every year we wait, more of the record is lost. And every year, he paused, and the pause was loaded with meaning, every year the hunger wakes up again. The hunger, Anita repeated. You keep saying that, the hunger, like it's alive. Andrew held her gaze. Isn't it? The wind outside picked up. The tent walls shuddered, and from somewhere in the forest, distant, impossible but unmistakable, came a sound. A low, sustained moan that rose and fell with the wind, that sounded like a voice, that sounded like a word, that sounded like nothing any of them had ever heard before, and yet knew in the marrow of their bones, in the deep, ancestral part of the brain that remembers what it was like to be prey, exactly what it meant. It meant hungry. The fifth day began with the smell. It came in the pre-dawn gray, before the camp was fully awake, seeping into the tents like smoke, like gas, like something that had weight and substance, and could be felt as well as smelled. It was the smell of rotting meat, not the clean, cold smell of frozen flesh, which has almost no scent, but the warm, wet, sweet-rotten smell of tissue in active decomposition, the smell of bacteria feeding, of cells rupturing, of the chemical processes of decay proceeding at a rate that should have been impossible at -36 degrees. Anita woke with the smell in her nose, and her first instinctive animal thought was, something is dead and it is close. She was out of her sleeping bag and into her boots in under 30 seconds. The camp was already stirring. Alina emerged from the medical tent, alert, her hand reaching for the kit. David stumbled out of the men's tent, his beard crusted with ice, his eyes wide. Renee stood outside her tent, camera in hand, her violet hair wild, her face the color of old parchment. "Where's Marcus?" Anita asked. They looked, they called his name. They checked his tent, his sleeping bag, the latrine, the perimeter of the camp. Marcus Chen, wildlife biologist, meticulous observer of the natural world, the man who had noted on the first day that the forest was not dormant but empty, was gone. His tent was intact. His sleeping bag was open, the interior still warm. Alina confirmed this with a gloved hand, her face tightening as she felt the residual warmth that meant he had been there recently. His boots were gone. His jacket was gone. His pack was still there. His glasses were on the ground beside his sleeping bag, folded neatly, as though he had taken them off deliberately before lying down. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood inside the tent, no torn fabric, no indication that Marcus had been dragged, forced, or otherwise removed against his will. It was as though he had simply woken up, put on his boots and jacket, walked out of the tent, and vanished. They found the footprint. It was 3 meters from Marcus's tent, pressed into the frost-crusted snow at the edge of the clearing. It was enormous, twice the size of a man's boot print, splayed, with 5 digits that ended in long, curved impressions that sank deep into the frost. The claws, or whatever they were, had left grooves in the frozen ground almost a centimeter deep, and the shape of the print was not quite human and not quite animal, but something in between. A hand pressed into the snow, a hand with too many joints in the fingers, and a palm that was too long and too narrow. And it was alone, a single print, no second print, no trail leading away from the tent or back to the trees, just one massive, clawed impression in the frost and then nothing. Anita, circling the camp, found the rest. A trail of blood, not a pool, not a splatter, but a trail, a thin, irregular line of droplets that led from the edge of the camp toward the trees. But the trail didn't follow the ground. It went up. The droplets were on the trunks of the trees, starting at the base and climbing, spaced further and further apart as they ascended, until they disappeared into the canopy, 30 feet above the ground. She stood at the base of the last tree and looked up. The canopy was a dark, dense tangle of branches against the gray sky. The blood trail vanished into it, and from somewhere in the canopy, from the dark, interlocking mass of branches and needles and snow, there came a sound. Dripping. The slow, rhythmic sound of liquid falling from a height. Drip, drip, drip. each drop landing in the snow at the base of the tree with a soft, almost inaudible thp, a sound so small and so regular that it was almost peaceful, almost calming, the sound of a leaky faucet in an empty house, a sound that meant nothing and everything and that Anita would hear in her dreams for the rest of her life. She knelt, looked at the snow where the drops were landing. Each drop was dark red, the red of venous blood, of blood that has not been exposed to air, of blood that comes from deep inside the body. And mixed with the blood, barely visible, dissolved in it but not quite, was something else, something small and pale and white. A fragment of bone. The camp descended into controlled panic. Alina took charge of the immediate medical assessment, checking everyone for injuries, signs of frostbite, hypothermia, shock. David was in the early stages of shock, his pulse rapid, his skin clammy, his pupils dilated. She wrapped him in a space blanket and made him drink hot tea and told him to breathe, and the breathing helped, but the look in his eyes, the look of a man who has spent his career studying what humans do to each other, and is now confronting the possibility that something not human might do the same things to him, did not change. Renee was photographing everything. The footprint, the blood trail, the canopy, the fragment of bone. She worked with the focused, mechanical precision of someone who has learned that the camera is a shield, that looking through a lens is not the same as looking with naked eyes, that distance, even optical distance, can be a form of protection. Andrew was in his tent, poring over the journal pages by the light of his headlamp, his hands trembling so badly that the pages rattled. Anita was making a decision. "We leave," she said. "Now, today. We pack up the camp, we load our packs, and we hike out. We come back in the spring with a larger team, better equipment, and a satellite phone that works." "The satellite phone doesn't work," Elena asked, her calm faltering for the first time. Anita held up the phone. The screen was on. The battery was full. The signal strength indicator showed 0 bars. She had tried it every hour since they'd arrived. Every hour the same result. No signal. Not a weak signal, not an intermittent signal. No signal at all, as though the phone were buried in concrete, as though the sky above them were made of something that absorbed radio waves. "It hasn't worked since we arrived," Anita said. "I didn't say anything because I thought it was temporary. It's not. We are cut off." The silence that followed was the silence of 5 people processing the reality of their situation. They were 4 days' hike from the road. The temperature was -36 and dropping. A member of their group was missing, presumed dead, taken by something that left clawed footprints and climbed trees with blood on its hands. Their only communication device was useless. "Andrew," Anita said, "we need to go." He emerged from his tent. His face was gray, the same ashen gray as the snow in the clearing, the same gray as the bark on the trees, and his eyes were burning with a fever intensity that Anita recognized now, with cold clarity, not as passion but as something pathological, something hungry. "I found it," he said. "The ritual, the full ritual, it's here, scattered across 3 pages that Pelletier didn't take. I've been reassembling it. I need another day. Maybe 2. "Andrew." "Another day, Anita. That's all I'm asking. One more day." She stared at him. She stared at the others, at Alina's controlled concern, at David's blank shock, at Renee's camera-clicking detachment. And she thought about the footprint, and the blood trail, and the sound of dripping from the canopy, and she made a decision that she would regret for the rest of her life. "One day," she said. "Tomorrow morning we leave, no arguments." Andrew nodded. His trembling hands clutched the journal pages to his chest. That night the voices began. They came in the deepest part of the dark, the hours between midnight and dawn when the cold reaches its peak, and the human body, deprived of sunlight and warmth and hope, begins to falter. Anita was awake, lying in her sleeping bag, watching her breath crystallize when she heard it. "Anita." The voice was Marcus's. It came from outside the tent, from the direction of the trees, and it was clear and warm and intimate. The voice of a friend calling to a friend. The voice of someone standing just beyond the circle of firelight, close enough to touch, close enough to help. "Anita, I'm cold. Please, I'm hurt. I need help." She sat up, her heart hammered. The voice was Marcus's, his exact cadence, his exact inflection, the slight upward lilt he gave to the last word of a sentence, the gentle, educated tone of a man who had spent his life in the measured world of academic science. It was perfect. It was Marcus. And it was wrong. The pitch was too high. Not dramatically, not a full octave, but subtly, fractionally, the kind of shift that you wouldn't notice if you weren't listening for it. The kind that registers not in the ears but in the gut, in the deep, pre-verbal part of the brain that processes not what a voice says but how it sounds, the part that tells you, without words, without logic, that something is not right. "Marcus," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Anita, please, I'm in the trees. I'm so cold. My leg is broken. I dragged myself to the edge of the clearing, but I can't go further. Please come and get me." She reached for the tent zipper. Her hand was shaking, not from the cold, not entirely, but from the shaking that comes when the body knows something the mind hasn't accepted yet. The shaking that says, "Don't go out there. Don't open that zipper. Don't step into the dark." Because what is waiting in the dark is not your friend and does not need help and is not cold. "Anita." The voice was closer now, closer to the tent, and beneath it, beneath Marcus's words, beneath his warmth, beneath his pain, there was the other sound. The sound that William had heard in 1848, the sound that Thomas Grier had described in his journal, the sound of chewing. The sound of something eating while it spoke. A wet, rhythmic, deliberate sound, like a jaw working slowly, methodically, through something that offered resistance but not enough resistance. Something that yielded but not immediately, something that was being consumed with the attention of something hungry. Anita's hand stopped on the zipper. "Marcus," she said, and her voice was steady now, steady and cold, the voice of a woman who had spent her life in the wilderness and had learned to trust the voice that spoke without words. "If you're really Marcus, tell me something only Marcus would know. Tell me the name of the paper you published last year." Silence. The chewing stopped. And then the voice came again, and this time the pitch was higher, noticeably higher, and the warmth was gone, and the intimacy was gone, and what was left was something flat and hollow and ravenous. A sound that was not a voice but a reproduction of a voice, a recording played at the wrong speed, a mask worn over a mouth that was too large and too wet and too hungry. "Anita, come out, I need you. I need you to come out." "Get away from the tent," Anita said. Her hand closed around the handle of her knife. "Get away from this camp." The voice stopped. The silence that followed was the worst sound Anita had ever heard, because the silence was not the absence of the voice but the presence of something that had heard her, that had understood her, that had decided, deliberately, intelligently, with the calculating patience of a predator that has been hunting for centuries, to comply. The silence moved away from the tent. It moved toward the trees. And then it was gone, and the clearing was quiet again, and the only sound was the wind and the breathing of 5 people who had not slept and would not sleep and who lay in their tents and listened to the nothing and knew, each of them, in the place where the body knows what the mind refuses to accept, that they were not alone in the forest, and they had never been alone, and the thing that was with them was patient, and it was hungry, and it was learning. The 6th day dawned gray and cold and wrong. Anita emerged from her tent at first light to find the clearing transformed, not by any visible change, but by a shift in the quality of the air, the light, the space itself. The ash-colored snow seemed darker, the gray deeper, the silence heavier. The trees at the perimeter of the clearing looked closer than they had the night before. Their branches extended further over the clearing, their trunks pressed tighter together, as though the wall of forest had contracted during the night, squeezing the clearing like a fist. She did not mention this to the others. She did not need to. David, emerging from his tent with the hollow, sleepless gaze of a man who has spent the night listening to voices that should not exist, looked at the trees and then at Anita and said nothing, but his face said everything. Did you see it too? Did you hear it too? Are we losing our minds, or is the world actually changing around us? They tried to leave. They packed the camp with the grim, efficient urgency of people who have decided that the only thing left to do is go. The packs were heavier now. They were carrying Marcus's share of the group gear, distributed among the 5 of them, and the work of breaking camp in the cold was brutal, every buckle a small torture, every zipper a negotiation with frozen metal and stiff fabric. They hiked south. Anita led, compass in hand, following the bearing they had established on the way in. The terrain should have been familiar, the same ravines, the same muskeg, the same dense spruce forest they had traversed 3 days earlier. And it was familiar, in the way that a face in a nightmare is familiar. The features are the same, the proportions are the same, but something is wrong, something has shifted. Something in the relation between the parts is different in a way that you cannot identify, but that makes your skin crawl. They hiked for 4 hours. The forest did not open up. The terrain did not change. The ravines and muskeg continued in an unbroken succession of obstacles, and the snow deepened rather than thinned, and the trees pressed closer, and the gray light grew dimmer, and the temperature continued to fall. And then, at the end of the 4th hour, they emerged into a clearing. The same clearing. The same ash-colored snow. The same circle of pits and mounds. The same wall of blackened trees. The same central depression where the cooking hearth had been, and where the fire pit still held the charred remnants of their campfire from the night before. Their footprints from the previous days were still visible in the snow, crisscrossing the clearing in patterns that should have led away from the site and instead, somehow, led back. David dropped his pack. He stood in the center of the clearing and turned in a slow circle, looking at the trees, the pits, the snow, the sky, and his face had the expression of a man who has just understood that the floor of his world has been removed and there is nothing beneath it. "We came back," he said. His voice was flat, toneless, the voice of a man speaking from inside a glass jar. "We hiked for 4 hours and we came back." "The geography has shifted," Anita said. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, compass in hand, watching the needle. The needle was not pointing north. It was not pointing south. It was spinning, slowly, lazily, without urgency, as though direction itself had become uncertain, as though the magnetic field of the earth had been replaced by something else, something that did not care about north or south or the axis of rotation or any of the physical laws that had, until this moment, been the bedrock of her understanding of how the world worked. "The compass is broken," Elena said. "The compass is not broken," Anita said. "The compass is working fine. It's the world that's broken." Renee took a photograph of the spinning compass. The shutter clicked. The sound was very loud in the silence. They tried again the next morning. They hiked east this time, following a different bearing, choosing a different route through the forest. They hiked for 6 hours, pushing through snow that reached their chests, climbing over fallen trees and wading through frozen muskeg, and at the end of the 6th hour they emerged into the clearing. The same clearing, the same ash-colored snow, the same pits and mounds, the same charred fire pit. Their footprints from the previous attempts were still visible, adding new patterns to the snow, new lines of passage that all led to the same destination. The clearing was not a place. The clearing was a trap, and the trap was not made of wood or stone or metal. The trap was made of space itself, of the relationship between here and there, between this point and that point, between the clearing and the world beyond the trees. The space between the clearing and the road was not distance. It was a loop, a fold, a wrinkle in the geography that turned every direction into the same direction, every path into the same path, every exit into the same entrance. Andrew, who had been largely silent since the previous day, sitting in his tent with the journal pages, emerged with a new expression on his face. Not the burning obsession, not the gray hunger, something else, something like vindication. "It's in the journal," he said. "Grier wrote about it. The woods will not release us," he wrote. "We have tried to leave 4 times, and each time the forest brings us back to the clearing. The clearing is the center. The clearing is the heart of the hunger. Everything flows toward it, the way water flows toward a drain. We are in the drain, and the drain is hungry, and the drain will not let us go." "Shut up, Andrew," Anita said. The words were so flat, so cold, so unexpected. Anita, who had been the model of professional control, who had spoken to Andrew with the patient, measured tone of a handler managing a difficult asset. Anita said "shut up" with the force of a door slamming, and the clearing went silent, and everyone looked at her, and she did not apologize, and she did not elaborate, and she did not look at Andrew. She was looking at the food. The remaining rations, 5 days' worth, carefully portioned, packed in waterproof bags and distributed among the packs, were laid out on a ground sheet in the center of the clearing, where Alina had been doing inventory. The rations were insufficient. Anita had known this since the first attempt to leave had failed. 5 days of food for 5 people, in a situation where 5 days might not be enough to break the loop, where the loop might not break at all. 5 days was not enough. 5 days was the edge. 5 days was the line between hungry and starving, between uncomfortable and desperate, between people and something else. She was not the only one looking at the food. David was looking at it. Renee was looking at it. Alina was looking at it. Andrew was looking at it. 5 people, standing in a circle around a ground sheet covered with freeze-dried meals and energy bars and trail mix, and the looking was not the casual looking of people taking inventory. The looking was the looking of people who were, for the first time, seeing the food not as a resource but as a quantity, a finite, diminishing, non-renewable quantity that stood between them and the thing that lived in the trees. The hunger was in the clearing. The hunger was in the air. The hunger was in the snow and the sky and the silence, and it was in them, seeping through their skin the way formaldehyde seeps through latex gloves, the way cold seeps through clothing, the way water seeps through stone. The hunger was not a feeling. The hunger was a contagion, and they were breathing it, and it was settling into their lungs and their blood and their bones. And the same whisper that the narrator in the snowdrift had heard, the same whisper that said "eat, eat, eat," was in the clearing now, was in the air, was in the silence, was in the space between their heartbeats. No one said anything. No one needed to. The looking was enough. The looking was the beginning of the thing that the folklore described, the thing that the journal documented, the thing that had happened to 37 people in 1848. The turn, the shift, the moment when the group stops being a group and becomes a collection of appetites, and the appetites stop being about food and start being about each other. The 7th day was when the arguments began. It started with David and Renee, standing over the food inventory, their voices low and tight and dangerous. The voices of people who are trying very hard not to shout, because shouting would acknowledge that the thing they are arguing about has become the most important thing in the world. "We should ration," David said. "Cut the portions in half, stretch the supply to 10 days. "We're already rationing," Renee said. "Half portions would be a quarter of what our bodies need to function in this cold. We'd be incapacitated in 3 days. Incapacitated is better than dead. Dead is what happens when we're too weak to move, and the thing in the trees comes for us." The word "thing" was new. Until that moment they had been careful, deliberately, collectively, silently careful, not to name what was in the trees, not to call it a creature, a monster, a Wendigo, not to give it the solidity of a name, the reality of a label. But the careful silence was breaking down, and the word "thing" was the first crack, and the crack widened quickly. "The thing in the trees," David repeated, and his voice had a new quality, a thickness, a heaviness, as though the words were being pulled from a place deeper than his throat. "The thing, you know what I think. I think there is no thing. I think there's cold and there's hunger and there's a forest that doesn't want us to leave and the rest. The voices, the footprint, the blood, that's us. That's our minds breaking. That's what happens when you starve people and put them in the dark and tell them stories about monsters. You don't believe that, Alina said from across the clearing, where she was boiling snow for water. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were not. Her eyes were moving, scanning the tree line, the canopy, the spaces between the tents, with the continuous, involuntary vigilance of someone who has accepted that the threat is real and is now operating in the mode that had kept her alive through 11 search and rescue missions. The mode of constant, exhausting readiness. I don't know what I believe, David said. I know I'm hungry. I know you're hungry. I know Andrew hasn't eaten in 2 days and he's turning gray. They all looked at Andrew. Andrew was sitting on a stone at the edge of the clearing, the journal pages in his lap, his head bent over the text. His skin had been gray for days, but the gray was deepening, spreading, migrating from his face down his neck and into his hands, the skin taking on the color of the ash-colored snow, the color of the tree bark, the color of the clearing itself, as though the clearing were claiming him, absorbing him, turning him into an extension of its own gray, hungry substance. He had not spoken since the previous evening. He had not eaten since the 5th day. He had not moved from the stone except to urinate, and the urine, Alina had noted with clinical detachment, was dark and concentrated and smelled of ketones, the smell of a body consuming its own fat, eating itself from the inside. Andrew, Alina said, approaching him with a cup of hot water, you need to drink. He looked up. His eyes were the worst part. The too bright gas flame blue had faded to a washed-out gray, and the pupils were too large, dilated in the flat gray light, giving him the look of something that sees in the dark, something that has adapted to a world without sun. He looked at Alina, and the looking was wrong. It was not the looking of a man at a woman. It was the looking of a thing at food. Hungry, he said, not a complaint, a declaration. Andrew, drink. Hungry, he said again, and this time the word came with a vibration that Alina felt in her sternum, a subsonic pulse that made the water in the cup tremble. She stepped back. The thing that was Andrew Hartwell was no longer entirely Andrew Hartwell, and the thing looking at her through his eyes was hungry in a way that had nothing to do with food. That night the voices came again, but this time they were not just Marcus's. They came from multiple directions, Marcus from the north, calling for help in his too high, too hungry voice. And another voice deeper, a voice Anita did not recognize at first until she realized it was David's voice. David, who was lying in the tent next to hers, who was alive and present and accounted for. David's voice was coming from the trees, calling her name, saying, Anita, come out. I've found a way through. I've found the trail. Come out and I'll show you. But David was in his tent. She could hear him breathing, ragged, shallow breaths that fogged the tent fabric in a steady rhythm. David was here. David was not in the trees. So what was in the trees, wearing David's voice? And then a third voice from the east, from the deepest part of the forest. This voice was not Marcus's or David's. It was a voice she did not know, a woman's voice, thin and reedy and desperate, saying, Help, please help, we're here. We've been here for so long. Please come and find us, please. And beneath all three voices the same sound, the chewing, the wet, rhythmic, deliberate sound of something eating while it spoke. Anita lay in her sleeping bag and pressed her hands over her ears and hummed, a low, tuneless hum that she maintained for hours, until her throat was raw and her jaw ached, and the first gray light of dawn leaked through the tent fabric, and the voices retreated to the trees, and the silence returned. Heavier and more oppressive than before, the silence of something that had been feeding all night and was full but not satisfied, because the hunger was never satisfied. The hunger was a void. The hunger was a black hole that consumed everything and gave nothing back and wanted more, always more. The 9th day was when Andrew told them what he had found. He stood in the center of the clearing, holding the journal pages, and his gray skin was luminous in the flat gray light, and his two large pupils were fixed on something in the middle distance that no one else could see. and he spoke with the quiet, intense authority of a man who has found the answer and does not care whether the answer is true. "The ritual," he said. "I've reassembled it. 3 pages from different parts of the settlement, written at different times, but they fit together. The ritual involves burning specific substances, sweetgrass, sage, and something called ash heart, which I believe is a type of fungus that grows on the blackened trees in this clearing. You burn them together while reciting a series of words in a language I can't identify. The text says that if the ritual is performed correctly, the thing that feeds will sleep, and the hunger will pass from the land like a shadow passes from a stone when the sun moves." "And you believe this?" Anita asked. Her voice was careful, measured, the voice of someone choosing words with the precision of a surgeon choosing incisions. "I believe that the people who lived here believed it, and I believe that the people who lived here had a reason to believe it. They were starving, Anita. They were in the same situation we're in, and they tried everything, fleeing, rationing, hiding. Nothing worked. The only thing that worked was the ritual, or at least the only thing that was worth writing down was the ritual." "Or," David said, his voice hollow and thin, "the ritual was the last delusion of a group of starving people who were grasping at anything that might give them hope, and it didn't work, and they died." "The journal says it worked," Andrew said. "Grier's last entry, the page that Pelletier didn't take, the page I found nailed to the tree at the north edge of the clearing, says, 'We performed the ritual at dawn. The thing retreated. The voices stopped. The hunger did not leave. I do not think the hunger ever leaves, but the thing retreated and the path opened and we walked south and the forest let us go.'" "And then what?" Elena asked. "They walked out and lived happily ever after." "No," Andrew said. "They walked out, but the journal doesn't say what happened after. The entry ends there. The forest let us go. And then nothing. The page is blank." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. The ritual might have worked. The forest might have let them go. But the blank page, the nothing after the escape, was worse than any entry could have been, because the nothing meant that the story was not finished, that the escape was not the end, that the hunger might follow you out of the forest and into the world, and the world would not know, and the world would feed you and you would eat, and the eating would not be enough, because the hunger was not in the food. The hunger was in you. Anita looked at Andrew. She looked at the journal pages in his gray, trembling hands. She looked at the ash-colored snow and the blackened trees and the gray sky and the clearing that was a trap and a drain and a mouth, and she thought about fire. She thought about the thermodynamics of combustion. She thought about the vapor pressure of white gas at -38 degrees. She thought about the volume of the clearing and the height of the canopy and the buoyancy of hot air in cold air, and the distance to the nearest ravine and the angle of the slope, and the fact that the creature, whatever it was a biological organism, and biological organisms have noses, and noses can be overwhelmed. "Andrew," she said, "give me the journal." "What?" "Give me the journal, all of it, every page." "Why?" "Because I'm going to burn it." Andrew stared at her, his gray face contorted, not with anger but with something worse, something more primal, something that looked like the expression of a creature being told that its food will be taken away. "You can't." "Everything burns," Anita said. "Everything we can't carry on our backs goes into the pit. The tents, the sleeping bags, the tools, the journal, the fuel, all of it. We burn it all, and the smoke and the smell create a wall that the thing can't see through and can't smell through, and while the fire burns, we run." The geography. Fire creates heat. Heat creates updrafts. Updrafts create air movement. Air movement disrupts the spatial trap. The clearing held us because the air is dead. Nothing moves, nothing changes. The cold preserves everything, including the shape of the space. But fire changes things. Fire creates chaos, and chaos might be the only way out. Elena stared at her. "You'll blow us up." "I'll blow the fire up. The butane canisters go in last. The fire becomes a chemical conflagration. The smoke, gasoline, butane, burning plastic is the only thing in this forest that smells like anything. The creature's nose, Grier wrote about it. The thing finds you by your scent. It follows the smell of your blood and your breath and your fear. If the whole clearing smells like burning fuel, it can't smell us. And then we run. While the fire burns, while it can't see us, can't smell us, we run. Alina stared at her. David stared at her. Renee stared at her. Andrew stared at her with his gray, dilated eyes that tracked the firelight with the hunger of something that had not eaten in days and was no longer interested in food. "Everyone helps," Anita said. "Everything burns, the tents, the sleeping bags, the tools, the journal, all of it goes into the pit. We build the fire, we wait for the creature to come, and when it does, when it's close, when it's in the clearing, we pour the fuel. The explosion, the smoke, the chemical stench, it'll blind it. It'll burn its nose, and while it's reeling, we run." "And the geography?" Alina asked. "The loop." "Fire creates heat. Heat creates updrafts. Updrafts create air movement. The clearing held us because the air is dead, nothing moves, nothing changes. Fire creates chaos, and chaos might be the only way out." No one argued. No one offered alternatives. The plan was not a good plan. It was a desperate plan, the kind of plan that is born not from strategy but from the last flicker of will in a group of people who have been beaten by the cold and the silence and the thing in the trees, and who have nothing left but the knowledge that doing something is better than doing nothing. They began to prepare the fire. The work was methodical. Anita inventoried the fuel: 4 butane canisters, 2 white gas stoves with a half-liter of fuel each, a can of emergency fire starter sticks, and the chemical heat packs from Alina's medical kit. She lined the central depression, the cooking hearth, the pit where Pelletier had found gnawed human bones, with kindling, splintered wood from the excavation tools, torn strips of tent fabric, pages from Grier's journal that Andrew had refused to surrender and that Anita had taken from his pack while he slept. The butane canisters went in last, positioned at the center, surrounded by the bulk of the combustible material, the sleeping bags and tents arranged in a teepee structure that would collapse inward as it burned. David stacked wood. He tore fabric. He carried stones to build a windbreak around the pit. He did not speak. His silence was not companionable, but the silence of someone whose internal monologue has become so loud that speech is redundant. Renee was taking photos. She photographed the fire preparation, the pit, the fuel, the faces of her companions. She photographed the trees, the ash-colored snow, the sky which had closed over again, the flat, oppressive gray that was the clearing's natural state. Alina was tending to Andrew. He had not eaten in 4 days. His body was consuming itself. The skin was gray and papery. The eyes were sunken and bright. The breath was shallow and rapid, carrying a faint ketotic sweetness, the smell of a body burning its own fat, a smell Alina associated not with medicine but with death. "Hungry," Andrew said, not a complaint, a declaration, an identity. "Hungry," he said again, and this time the word came with a vibration Alina felt in her sternum, a subsonic pulse that made the water tremble and the air shimmer. She jerked her hand back. The thing that was Andrew Hartwell was no longer entirely Andrew Hartwell, and the thing looking at her through his eyes was hungry in a way that had nothing to do with food. Anita lit the fire at noon. The butane caught first, a blue-white flare that shot up from the pit like a tongue of chemical flame, and the kindling caught, and the tent fabric caught, and within 60 seconds the fire was a living thing, a roaring, crackling, spitting entity that consumed everything it touched with the ravenous, indiscriminate appetite of something that had been waiting to be born. The smoke was black, thick, oily, chemical-laden black smoke that rose in a column from the pit and climbed, climbing, through the dead air of the clearing, through the gap in the canopy, up into the gray sky where it spread like a stain, like a signal, like a scream made visible. The heat was immediate and enormous. The fire was small, no more than 8 feet across, but the intensity of the burning synthetic materials produced a radiant heat that pushed back the cold, and for the first time in 9 days, the group felt warm. For a moment, 1, 2, 3 seconds, the world was tolerable. The fire was warm, the smoke was rising, someone would see it, someone would come. And then the creature came. It did not emerge from the trees. It did not step into the clearing. It materialized. There is no other word for the way it appeared, the way it went from not being there to being there in the space between one heartbeat and the next, as though the clearing had always contained it and they had simply not been able to see it, as though it had been standing there the entire time, camouflaged by the gray air and the gray snow and the gray light, and the fire had stripped away the camouflage and revealed what had been waiting. It was tall, 8 feet, perhaps 9, perhaps more. The height was difficult to judge because the thing was not standing the way a human stands but was crouched, bent forward, its long arms hanging in front of it, its fingers, not hands, fingers long and jointed and ending in dark, curved nails, touching the ground. Its body was emaciated, not thin, emaciated. The ribs were visible, each one a distinct ridge beneath skin that was the color of wet ash, gray and damp and translucent in the firelight, stretched so tight over the skeleton that the bones threatened to tear through, and in several places they had. The points of the hip bones and the ribs and the spine had punctured the skin, and from these punctures, a dark, viscous fluid oozed slowly, like sap from a wounded tree. But the head was a skull, a deer skull, bleached white, the antlers towering, branching, spreading upward and outward in a complex fractal architecture that was almost beautiful, almost symmetrical, but not quite, the left antler having one more tine than the right, a single asymmetry that made the skull look not like a death mask but like a face. A specific face. A face that belonged to a specific creature with a specific history and a specific hunger. The eye sockets were empty, dark, 2 voids in the white bone, the kind of void that should be empty, that should be dead, that should be nothing. They were not empty. Inside the sockets, burning with a steady, pulsing, amber light that was not the reflection of the fire but a source of its own, were eyes. Human eyes. Not the eyes of a deer, not the eyes of an animal. Human eyes, with irises and pupils and the wet, intelligent sheen of a consciousness that was not animal but something else, something that had once been human and was now something beyond human. Something that had eaten so much and been hungry for so long that the hunger had become the being. The hunger was the creature was the hunger, and the hunger was looking at them through the skull of a deer with human eyes, and it was intelligent and it was patient and it was, above all, starving. Anita stared at it. She stared at the creature that she had spent 9 days telling herself was a story, a folklore, a metaphor, and she felt something that was not fear. Fear was too small, too human, too personal a word for what she felt. What she felt was the feeling of being looked at by something that was older than the forest, older than the settlement, older than the hunger that had driven 37 people to their deaths in this clearing 178 years ago. What she felt was the feeling of being seen not as a person, but as a meal, as a collection of nutrients, as a quantity of food. The Wendigo opened its mouth. The jaw of the deer skull hinged open, not the way a real deer's jaw opens, with the limited, herbivorous range of a grazing animal, but wide, wider than any bone should allow, the mandible dropping and the maxilla lifting and the whole skull opening like a door, revealing inside not the hollow of a bone but a cavity, a throat. A passage that descended into something dark and wet and alive. A passage that contracted and expanded with a slow, rhythmic pulse that was breathing. And the breath that came out was warm and wet and smelled of formaldehyde and rotting meat, and the sweet, cloying scent of something that had been dead for a very long time and was still eating. It screamed. The sound was not a scream in any conventional sense. It was a pressure, a sudden, massive compression of the air that pushed against the eardrums like a fist, that made the fire shudder and the smoke waver and the snow around the clearing crystallize into a finer, sharper powder. It was the sound of hunger made audible, the sound of an emptiness so vast and so profound that it had become a force, a gravity, a black hole that pulled sound and light and warmth into itself and gave nothing back. And then it moved. The Wendigo moved the way lightning moves, not running, not walking, not leaping, but translating, displacing itself from one position to another without traversing the space in between. A blur of gray skin and white bone and amber eyes that covered 30 feet in the time it takes to blink, and David was the first to go. David Ackafer, historian, scholar, the man who had spent his career studying the social dynamics of isolated colonial settlements, was standing at the edge of the firelight, holding an armful of tent fabric to feed the flames, and the Wendigo was on him before he could drop it. It did not kill him. It grabbed, casually, almost gently, with one long-fingered hand, the fingers closing around David's upper arm, and it pulled. It pulled David off his feet and into the air and toward the trees, and David screamed. And the scream was human and terrified and agonizing and real. And then the trees swallowed him, and the scream continued for 4 more seconds. And then the scream stopped, and the clearing was silent except for the fire and the wind and the sound of the Wendigo chewing. Renee ran. She ran not toward the trees, not toward the fire, but toward the center of the clearing, toward the pit, toward the flames, as though the fire could protect her. She made it 6 steps. The Wendigo came from the left, a blur, a gust, a displacement of air that knocked the fire sideways and scattered burning debris across the clearing. And a hand, a gray, emaciated hand with fingers too long and too jointed, closed around Renee's camera and Renee's hand and Renee's wrist and Renee's arm and pulled. And Renee was gone, pulled into the gray air, pulled into the trees, and the camera fell to the snow with a thud and a clatter, and the shutter fired one last time. A single photograph, taken by the impact, of the gray sky and the black smoke and the amber eyes of the thing that had taken her. Elena grabbed Andrew. She grabbed him by the collar of his parka and hauled him to his feet and dragged him toward the fire, because the fire was the only thing the creature seemed reluctant to cross, and she held Andrew in front of her, not because she wanted to sacrifice him, but because he was the only thing left to hold. "Anita," Elena screamed. "Anita, the fuel, do it now." Anita was standing beside the fire. The fire was still burning. The butane canisters had not yet ignited. The main fuel load was still feeding the flames, and she was holding the remaining canister of white gas fuel in one hand and a box of emergency matches in the other. She was not thinking about David. She was not thinking about Renee. She was not thinking about Andrew or Elena or the creature or the hunger or the journal or the ritual. She was thinking about the thermodynamics of combustion. She was thinking about the vapor pressure of white gas at -38 degrees. She was thinking about the volume of the clearing and the height of the canopy and the buoyancy of hot air in cold air, and the distance to the nearest ravine, and the angle of the slope, and the fact that the creature, whatever it was a biological organism, and biological organisms have noses, and noses can be overwhelmed. "I can't carry Andrew and run," Elena said, and her voice was steady, her eyes were clear, and she was not crying and she was not shaking. She was the most calm and the most human Anita had ever seen her, because in the moment of her own death, Elena Vasquez had found the thing that had been hiding beneath the calm and the competence and the steady paramedic's presence. She had found her purpose. She was here to keep people alive. That was her function, and the function required her to stay. "Run," Elena said. "Run and don't look back and don't stop and don't listen to the voices, because the voices are not real and the hunger is not real, and the only thing that is real is the trail and the snow and the distance between you and the road. Go." Anita looked at Elena. She looked at Andrew. She looked at the fire and the smoke and the gray clearing and the trees and the sky and the snow and the world that was about to end for everyone except her. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be sorry, be fast." Anita poured the white gas on the fire. The explosion was a whump, deep, concussive, felt in the chest and the teeth and the soles of the boots, and then the fire erupted. The white gas vaporized on contact with the burning material, and the vapor ignited, and the fireball rose from the pit in a column of orange and yellow and black, 30 feet across and 100 feet high, and the butane canisters caught and burst, and the fire became a chemical conflagration that consumed everything in the clearing: tents, tools, sleeping bags, the journal pages, the food packets, the paracord, the space blankets, everything. And the smoke that rose from it was thick and black and acrid, and smelled of gasoline and burning plastic and chemical fire. And the smell was enormous, a wall of stench that covered the clearing like a blanket. The Wendigo screamed. This time the scream was different. It was the scream of a creature whose primary sense had been assaulted, overwhelmed, destroyed. Its nose, that hypersensitive, supernatural, hunger-driven nose, the nose that could follow the scent of blood through a frozen forest, the nose that had found Marcus in his tent and dragged him into the canopy, was burning. The chemical smoke was in its sinuses, its lungs, the wet, living tissue behind the deer skull, and the creature was reeling, staggering, its amber eyes wide and watering, its long-fingered hands clawing at its own face, and it was retreating, pulling back from the fire, pulling back from the smoke. And in the moment of its retreat, Anita ran. She ran north. She ran into the trees, into the wall of blackened spruce and pine that had been her prison for 9 days, and the trees parted. Not literally, branches did not move, trunks did not shift, but the space between the trees opened, the way a hallway opens when you walk through it. And Anita was through the wall of trees and into the forest beyond, and the forest was not the ash-colored clearing. The forest was a forest, dark, cold, silent, snow-covered. But it was a real forest, a forest that existed in geography, in topography, in the physical world of maps and compasses and GPS coordinates, and her GPS, still clutched in her hand, pinged. 1 bar. The signal flickered, wavered, disappeared, reappeared. 1 bar, but 1 bar was enough. 1 bar was a position, a coordinate, a point on a map, a real location in a real world. She ran. The terrain was brutal. Ravines cut through the forest like wounds, deep and snow-filled, dropping 20 feet without warning. She fell into the first one, landed hard, climbed out, ran. The second was wider. She slid down and scrambled up the far wall on hands and knees. Behind her, the smoke rose above the canopy, a column of black against the gray sky. The third ravine nearly killed her. The far wall was refrozen ice, smooth and holdless. She tried 3 times, failed 3 times, and on the 4th attempt she drove her knife into the ice and hauled herself up 1 hand width at a time, the blade slipping, the ice cracking, and she fell forward over the lip and was running before the pain registered. She ran for 4 hours. She ran until the smoke behind her was a thin line on the horizon. She ran until the smell of the fire faded and the cold air filled her lungs again, and the world was white and gray and silent, and she was alone. She ran until her legs would not carry her and her lungs would not fill and her heart would not slow, and she collapsed in a snowdrift at the edge of a frozen creek and lay there, face down in the snow, and felt the cold take her. She lay in the snow, and she was cold, and she was alone, and she was not hungry. Not hungry. For the first time in 9 days, the hunger was gone. The whisper was gone. The pull, the pressure, the inward gravity of the thing that had been living in her belly, gone. The fire had burned it out, or the running had burned it out, or the distance had burned it out, or maybe it had never been in her at all. Maybe it had always been in the clearing, in the snow, in the air, and leaving the clearing had been the only ritual that mattered. She lay in the snow, and she was not hungry, and she was cold, and she was alive. She reached the ranger station on the morning of the 11th day. The station was a small, log-built structure on the shore of a frozen lake. 23 miles from the clearing by the route she had traveled, a route that had taken her 2 days of walking, crawling and stumbling through the boreal forest on frozen feet and an empty stomach, and a will that had been forged in the fire and tempered in the cold. She walked through the unlocked door of the ranger station and said, "My name is Anita Voss. I was part of an expedition in the Wabakimi wilderness. There were 6 of us. I'm the only one who came back." The helicopter arrived in 2 hours. The rangers wrapped her in a thermal blanket and helped her into the aircraft, and the helicopter lifted off and banked south, and Anita looked out the window at the forest below, the vast, white, silent expanse of the boreal forest, stretching to the horizon, featureless and cold and empty. From the air, the forest looked like a photograph, flat, still, a monochrome landscape of white and gray and black. The ravines she had stumbled through were invisible from this altitude, just wrinkles in the snow, barely distinguishable from the drifts and the shadows. The clearing was invisible too. From the air there was no clearing. There was no settlement. There was no evidence that any of it had happened. She thought she saw, in the distance, a thin column of smoke rising from the trees, and she thought she saw at the base of the smoke a shape, a gray, emaciated shape with white antlers that spread against the sky like the branches of a dead tree. And then the helicopter banked again and the shape was gone. Or had never been there. Or had been there and had never been there. And the distinction from this distance, from this side of survival, was a distinction that no longer mattered. They brought her to the hospital in Thunder Bay. She was treated for hypothermia, frostbite, malnutrition, and what the medical staff described in their notes as acute psychological trauma. She was given a bed, a warm room, and a bowl of hot stew. The stew was hot. It smelled of beef and vegetables and salt and warmth, and the smell filled the room, and the room was warm, and the bed was soft, and the world was safe, and Anita was alive and she was not hungry. She was not hungry. She looked at the stew. The stew smelled of beef and vegetables, and salt and warmth. And something else. Underneath the beef and the vegetables and the salt and the warmth, there was another smell, a chemical smell, a preservative tang, the smell of biology classrooms and funeral homes, the smell of things that had once been alive and were now being kept from rotting by artificial means. Formaldehyde. Anita stared at the stew. She stared at it for a long time. The stew was hot and brown and it smelled of beef and formaldehyde, and the smell was not coming from the stew. The smell was coming from her skin, from her hands. From the breath that she exhaled onto the surface of the stew and watched the steam rise, and the steam smelled of decay, and the decay was inside her. It was in her blood and her tissue and her bones. It had been in her since the clearing, since the hunger, since the first night when the silence pressed against the tent and the voice whispered her name. She was not hungry. She had not been hungry since the fire. The hunger was gone. But the smell was still there. The formaldehyde, the decay, the gray. She looked at her hands that had been red and raw from the cold, her hands that had gripped the knife and the fuel canister and the GPS unit and the snow and the earth and the walls of the ravines. Her hands were gray. Not the gray of cold, not the gray of exhaustion, the gray of wet ash, the gray of dead things, the gray of things pulled from cold water. The gray of the Wendigo. She looked at her hands, and the hands were gray, and she was not hungry, had not been hungry in 2 days, had not wanted to eat in 2 days, and the not wanting was not the absence of hunger but the transformation of hunger. The same transformation she had seen in Andrew's eyes, the same transformation that had turned Andrew's 2 bright blue eyes to washed-out gray, the same transformation that had turned his skin the color of ash-colored snow. She was not hungry. She was hungry for something else. Anita sat in the hospital bed, wrapped in a blanket, and she understood, with a clarity that was worse than the cold and the hunger and the thing in the trees, that the hunger had not left her. The hunger had not left her because the hunger was not in the clearing. The hunger was not in the forest. The hunger was not in the creature with the deer skull and the human eyes. The hunger was in her. The hunger had always been in her. And the hunger was patient, and the hunger was learning, and the hunger whispered, not in words, not in a voice, but in a pressure, a direction, a pull, and the whisper said, "Eat." And the whisper would not stop, and the whisper was not in the clearing or the forest or the creature. The whisper was in her, and it had always been in her, and it would always be in her, and it whispered. The rangers had given her a mirror. She picked it up and looked at her face and saw the gray spreading across her cheekbones, across her forehead, across the bridge of her nose. She looked at her eyes and saw the pale blue fading, the pupils dilating too wide, the intelligence behind them shifting from human to something else, something patient, something predatory, something that had once been Anita Voss and was now becoming something that did not have a name, but that the folklore, the journals, the ancient texts had tried to name anyway, had tried to capture in a word that was both a warning and a diagnosis. Wendigo. She put down the mirror. She looked at the stew. The stew was hot and brown, and it smelled of beef and formaldehyde, and the smell was coming from her, and she was not hungry, had not been hungry in days, and the not hunger was the hunger, and the hunger was the transformation, and the transformation was nearly complete. And Anita Voss, wilderness survival instructor, search and rescue volunteer. The woman who had survived the clearing and the creature and the cold and the fire, sat in a warm bed in a safe room in a hospital in Thunder Bay, and understood that survival was not the same as escape, and that escape was not the same as freedom, and that the hunger was not a monster in the woods but a seed that had been planted in the frozen ground of her body and was now, in the warmth, beginning to grow. The whisper said, "Eat." And Anita Voss, who had spent her life trusting the voice that speaks without words, listened. The frozen heart. Charlie Hopper was screaming, but not from pain. The screaming was the kind that comes from paradox, the brain's inability to reconcile two contradictory sensory inputs, the impossibility of being burned by something that is frozen. The thing in front of him, a hand, a finger, a massive, skinless digit that reached out of the whiteout like the arm of a drowned man reaching up from the bottom of a lake, was cold. He knew it was cold because the air around it was crystallizing, the moisture in the atmosphere flash freezing into a cloud of ice crystals that hung in the air like diamonds. But the cold was not the absence of heat. The cold was a weapon. The cold was a force. The cold was the thing's heat, its body temperature, its radiant energy, the thermal signature of an organism that should have been dead and was not, an organism whose internal temperature was so far below zero that the contact between its flesh and the atmosphere produced not melting but burning, a paradoxical, impossible burning, the kind of burning that happens when cold exceeds the body's ability to maintain thermal equilibrium and the skin, instead of freezing, simply gives up. The finger touched the pine tree. The tree ignited. Not slowly, not the gradual, organic combustion of wood exposed to flame. Instantly. The frozen needles coated in ice, encased in rime, saturated with the moisture of a polar vortex that had been pushing temperatures to -30 for 2 weeks, burst into fire. Blue fire. The fire of chemical decomposition, of thermal shock so extreme that the cellulose in the wood broke apart at the molecular level, the bonds between atoms severed by a transfer of energy so rapid and so violent that the wood did not burn but disintegrated. The molecules flying apart and recombining with oxygen in a chain reaction that consumed the tree from the point of contact outward in a wave of blue-white light that was not fire in any sense that Charlie had ever experienced but was something else, something that had no name because it had never been witnessed by human eyes. Charlie screamed. He screamed because the paradox was breaking his brain. The sight of a frozen corpse igniting a frozen tree was a logical impossibility, a violation of thermodynamics, a thing that could not happen, and his brain, which was a machine for processing reality, was encountering input that did not process, that jammed the gears and stripped the threads and left the machine running in neutral, screaming, screaming, screaming. He stopped screaming, not because the paradox had resolved, it hadn't, but because the screaming was using energy he didn't have. He was in a snowdrift. He was buried to the waist. His legs were numb, his fingers were white, his core temperature was dropping, and the thing in the whiteout was reaching for him, its skinless finger extending from the wall of white like a periscope from the water, and the finger was not reaching for the tree anymore. It was reaching for him. Charlie closed his eyes. He thought of warmth. He thought of the research station, the propane heater in the common room, the thick walls of insulated concrete, the stockpile of canned goods and dehydrated rations and industrial road salt that they had brought for the winter access road. He thought of the other people at the station, the geologists, the guides, the people who were alive and warm and real. He thought of Kale, the head guide who had warned them about the Chenoo, who had told them that the hunger of the winter could turn a man into something else. He thought about fire. And the finger touched his cheek. The burning was immediate and total and wrong. Wrong because it was cold. Because the thing that was burning him was colder than the air, colder than the snow, colder than the wind. And the cold burned the way acid burns, not with heat but with dissolution, with the rapid, violent destruction of tissue at the cellular level. The cells of his cheek rupturing as the thermal gradient between the thing's touch and his skin exceeded the capacity of his flesh to maintain integrity. Charlie opened his eyes. The finger was an inch from his face. It was massive, the width of a man's wrist, the length of a forearm, the skin not merely absent but removed, peeled away, the underlying muscle and tendon and bone exposed to the air, and the muscle was not red but gray, the color of frozen meat, the color of tissue that has been dead for a long time but is still moving, still functioning, still hungry. And behind the finger, emerging from the whiteout, taking shape in the wall of driven snow like a ship emerging from fog, was the rest of it. The Chenoo was tall, 8 feet, maybe 9. Its body was gaunt, emaciated in the way that only a creature that has been starving for centuries can be emaciated, the bones visible through the remnants of muscle and skin, the ribs like the bars of a cage, the pelvis a sharp, jutting shelf beneath a belly that was hollow, concave, sucked inward by a hunger so profound that the body had begun to consume itself. The patches of skin that remained on the shoulders, the thighs, the forearms, were not skin in any functional sense. They were remnants, fragments, strips of tissue that clung to the body like bandages, gray and translucent, and covered in a frost that was not ice but crystallized fat, the subcutaneous lipid layer having frozen and sublimated, and recrystallized on the surface of the skin in a fine white powder that made the creature look in the whiteout like a sculpture made of snow. The eyes were the worst part. They were wolfish, not the eyes of a wolf too large, too forward-facing, too intelligent, but wolfish in the way that the word wolfish is used to describe a specific quality of hunger, a specific intensity of predatory attention, a specific way of looking at the world that says, I will eat you, not because I hate you, not because I fear you, because I am hungry and you are food and the hunger is all that I am. The eyes glowed, not with light, with heat. The irises were amber, but the amber was not a pigment. It was incandescence. The eyes were so hot, so impossibly, paradoxically hot in a body that radiated cold, that the fluid in the anterior chamber was near boiling, and the heat was visible, a faint, shimmering glow that made the eyes look like 2 coals set in the skull of a frozen corpse. Charlie stared into those eyes, and the eyes stared back, and in the eyes Charlie saw 2 things simultaneously, hunger and intelligence. Not animal intelligence, the calculating, strategic intelligence of a predator that understands cause and effect, that learns from experience, that adapts. And behind the intelligence, deeper, older, more fundamental, the hunger that drove the intelligence. The hunger that was the creature's reason for existing, the hunger that was its identity, its soul, its heart. The heart, the frozen heart. Charlie would learn later, from Kale, from the journal of a previous expedition, from the accumulated knowledge of people who had survived encounters with the Chenoo and had passed their knowledge down through generations of oral tradition, that the creature's heart was not a heart in any biological sense. It was ice, a block of ice, formed in the chest cavity where the heart should have been, crystal clear and jagged, the size of a man's fist, and the ice was not frozen water but frozen hunger, solidified, crystallized, permanent. The heart was the source of the creature's cold and its hunger simultaneously. The cold radiated outward from the heart, keeping the body preserved, keeping the tissue functional, keeping the organism alive long past any natural lifespan. And the hunger radiated inward from the body, channeled back to the heart, feeding it, sustaining it, making the ice grow stronger and colder and harder with every meal. The Chenoo was not a monster. It was a process, a cycle. Cold producing hunger, hunger producing cold, the two feeding each other in a feedback loop that had been running for centuries, that would run for centuries more, that would run until the heart was destroyed or the hunger was satisfied, and the hunger could never be satisfied because the hunger was not for food. The hunger was for warmth. The hunger was for the heat that the creature's own cold had stolen from the world, the heat that it radiated away with every breath, every touch, every step, the heat that was gone, lost, spent, and that the creature would chase forever, consuming everything warm and living and alive in a futile, endless attempt to fill the frozen void in its chest. The finger touched Charlie's cheek. The burning intensified. And in the whiteout, in the screaming wind, in the -30 air of the polar vortex, Charlie Hopper felt something that no human being should ever feel. The touch of a thing that is colder than cold. That is the absence of warmth. That is the end of heat. That is the thing that waits at the bottom of the thermometer. The thing that has no name because it has no number. The temperature at which atoms stop moving, at which energy ceases, at which the universe itself would freeze if the cold were allowed to spread. And Charlie ran. 3 weeks earlier, the research station had been a different place entirely. Station Zero. It had no official name, only a designation on the USGS registry, was a 2-story structure built into the granite flank of a mountain in the Maine wilderness, 40 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible in winter only by snowmobile or helicopter. It had been constructed in the 1970s as a geological survey outpost, a base of operations for teams studying the glacial geology of the region, and it had been in continuous operation since then, staffed year-round by rotating teams of researchers and support personnel who came for the isolation, the data, or the simple, perverse pleasure of spending a winter in one of the most inhospitable environments on the eastern seaboard. The station was built to withstand the worst. The walls were 12 inches of reinforced concrete, insulated with closed-cell foam and sheathed in steel. The windows were triple-paned, argon-filled, rated for -60. The heating system was a propane furnace with a 60-day reserve, backed up by a diesel generator with a 30-day supply and a wood stove that could burn anything combustible. The water came from a well drilled into the granite, fed by an aquifer that was believed to be fed by glacial melt. The food supply was sufficient for 4 people for 90 days. Canned goods, dehydrated rations, military MREs, and a stockpile of industrial road salt that was used to keep the winter access road passable during the shoulder seasons. There were 7 people at the station when the polar vortex hit. Charlie Hopper, 28, a geologist from the University of Maine, was the youngest member of the team and the one who had been there the longest. He had overwintered at Station Zero twice before and knew the station's systems the way a pilot knows an aircraft, by feel, by sound, by the particular way the furnace cycled and the generator hummed and the water pump shuddered when the pipes were cold. He was compact, red-haired, with the kind of restless energy that made him good at winter field work. He didn't mind the cold, he didn't mind the isolation, and he didn't mind the boredom because his mind was always working, always processing, always building models of the world from the data he collected. Dr. Ruth Albright, 53, the station's lead researcher, a glaciologist who had spent 20 years studying the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, and who had come to Station Zero because the mountain's glacial features offered a unique opportunity to study a continental ice sheet that was not Arctic but temperate, a remnant of the last ice age that had survived in the mountains of Maine because of a combination of altitude, aspect, and a microclimate that kept the temperature below freezing for most of the year. She was tall, angular, with silver hair that she kept in a practical bun, and a manner that was not cold but precise, the manner of a scientist who values accuracy over comfort and who has learned that in field work, accuracy is comfort. Cale Michaud, 44, the head guide. Cale was a member of the Penobscot Nation, born and raised in the communities along the Penobscot River, and he had been guiding in the Maine wilderness since he was 17. He knew the mountain and its valleys the way a person knows a house they've lived in their whole life, not as a collection of trails and landmarks, but as a living, breathing entity with moods and habits and preferences. He was not a large man, average height lean, with the economy of movement that comes from a lifetime of navigating difficult terrain. But he carried an authority that was not physical but spiritual, the authority of a man who understands his place in the landscape and who respects the powers that inhabit it. The others were Dr. James Park, 41, a seismologist from the USGS, who was at the station to monitor a cluster of micro-earthquakes that had been detected in the region. Leslie Park, no relation to James, 36, a meteorologist from NOAA, who was there to study the atmospheric dynamics of the polar vortex. Mark Davison, 32, a field technician responsible for maintaining the station's instruments and infrastructure. And Dana Reyes, 27, a graduate student working under Dr. Albright on a thesis about glacial retreat patterns. 7 people, 1 mountain, 1 station, and a winter that was about to break every record that had ever been set. The polar vortex arrived on January 12th. It came not as a storm but as a presence, a shift in the atmosphere that was not weather but climate, not a local phenomenon but a continental one, the kind of cold that affects not a region but a hemisphere. The jet stream, which normally kept the Arctic air mass confined to the high latitudes, had weakened, and the vortex, the persistent, rotating mass of cold air that sits over the pole, had wobbled, destabilized, and split. One fragment had descended south, across Canada, across the Great Lakes, across New England, and had settled over the mountains of Maine like a blanket made of cold, not the cold of winter but the cold of the Arctic, the cold of -40, -50, the cold that kills. The temperature dropped in a single night from -5 to -32. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze, became a sustained gale, 40 miles per hour, driving the snow horizontally and reducing the visibility to the length of a football field. The station's instruments, thermometers, barometers, anemometers, registered the change with the mechanical indifference of devices that do not know what they measure, and the data they produced was transmitted by satellite uplink to databases that would be analyzed by people who were warm and safe, and who would not, for weeks, understand what the numbers meant. Cale understood what the numbers meant. He was standing at the window of the common room watching the snow when Charlie came in with the morning's readings. Charlie was cheerful. He had slept well, the furnace was running, the generator was topped up, and the readings were interesting if not alarming. The temperature was dropping, the pressure was falling, the wind was increasing. It was cold, it was getting colder, and it would be the coldest night of the winter so far. -32, Charlie said, setting the clipboard on the table. And the forecast says it's going to drop another 10 degrees by tomorrow. Wind chill's going to be -60. Cale didn't respond. He was still looking out the window. His face in the gray light had an expression that Charlie had never seen on it before. Not fear, not concern, but a kind of attentiveness, a kind of focus, as though he were listening to something that only he could hear. "Cale, you okay?" "The Chenoo," Cale said. Charlie waited. He had heard the word before. Cale had mentioned it during the orientation. A brief, almost offhand reference to a local legend, a creature from Penobscot folklore that was associated with extreme cold and insatiable hunger. Charlie had filed it under local color, the kind of thing that guides mention to entertain the scientists, the kind of thing that sounds interesting around a campfire and means nothing in a laboratory. "The Chenoo," Cale said again, and this time he turned from the window and looked at Charlie, and his eyes were not the eyes of a man telling a story. They were the eyes of a man issuing a warning. "The hunger of the winter. My grandmother told me about it. She said the Chenoo comes when the cold gets bad enough, when the temperature drops below a certain point and stays there, when the frost reaches a certain depth, when the hunger of the cold becomes a hunger that walks." "Cale, the Chenoo is a story. It's a mythological figure. It's not a story," Cale said. His voice was quiet, steady, the voice of a man who has lived his entire life in proximity to things that science does not measure, and who has learned that the absence of measurement is not the absence of existence. "The Chenoo is a man, or it was a man who was so hungry that his heart turned to ice, and when his heart turned to ice, he stopped being a man and became something else. Something that is still hungry but can never be full. Something that is cold but radiates heat. Something that eats but is never satisfied." "Cale, I'm not asking you to believe it, Charlie. I'm asking you to listen. Because the cold is coming, and the cold is bad, and the cold brings things that you don't find in your textbooks." Charlie listened. He didn't believe, not in the Chenoo, not in the literal biological reality of a creature that Cale was describing, but he believed in Cale. He believed in the man's knowledge of the land, in his experience, in the particular kind of wisdom that comes from spending a lifetime in a landscape that does not forgive mistakes. And he filed the warning away, not as a fact but as a data point, a piece of information that might or might not be relevant, a variable that he would keep in the equation until it resolved or canceled out. The equation, he would learn, would not cancel out. The variable would resolve, and the resolution would be the worst thing he had ever experienced. The first disappearance happened on the 4th day of the vortex. Mark Davison, the field technician, went out at dawn to check the instrument tower, a 50-foot mast on the ridge above the station that carried the anemometers, the thermistors, the solar panels, and the satellite uplink antenna. The instruments had been registering anomalous readings since the vortex hit. Temperature spikes that didn't match the ambient air pressure fluctuations that had no meteorological explanation. Seismic signals that were not tectonic but something else. Something rhythmic. Something that Dr. Park had described in his careful, precise seismologist's voice as biological. "Biological seismic signals," Charlie had asked. "What does that mean?" "I don't know," Dr. Park had admitted. "The signal is a rhythmic, low-frequency vibration, about 0.3 Hz, which is well below the range of any known geological process. The frequency is consistent with a heartbeat, a very large heartbeat. A heartbeat, seismically detectable. The signal is there. The interpretation is what we're arguing about. Mark is going out to check the instruments, to make sure the seismometer is calibrated and the signal isn't an artifact." Mark left at 6 a.m. He was dressed for the conditions, full Arctic kit, insulated coveralls, face mask, goggles, 2 pairs of gloves, boots rated for -60. He carried a radio and a personal locator beacon. The walk to the instrument tower was 800 meters, uphill, through snow that was knee-deep on the level and chest-deep in the drifts. He had made the trip dozens of times. It took 20 minutes. He did not come back. By 8 a.m., when Mark had not returned and the radio was producing only static, the station went into search mode. Dr. Park and Charlie suited up and went out, following Mark's boot prints from the station door to the ridge. The prints were clear. The snow was hard enough to hold the impression, and the wind, though strong, had not yet filled them in. The prince led up the ridge, past the instrument tower, and down the other side toward the tree line. At the tree line, the prince stopped. They did not stop gradually. They did not fade. They ended abruptly in a pair of boot marks that were pressed deep into the snow, the heels dug in, the toes pointed forward, the posture of a man standing still, not running, not walking, just standing. The impression was deep and clear, as though Mark had stood there for several minutes, the weight of his body compressing the snow beneath his boots into a firm, defined impression. And from the boot marks, two things radiated. The first was a trail of melted snow. Not a path, a trail, a line, a track of liquid water that ran from Mark's last position toward the tree line. The snow melted so completely and so recently that the water was still flowing, still warm, pooling in the depression and running downhill in a thin, steaming stream. The water was warm. Charlie knelt beside it and put his gloved hand into the stream, and the water was not warm. It was hot. Hot water, in -32-degree air, flowing from the tree line toward the station. And the heat was wrong. The heat was impossible. The heat was a violation of thermodynamics as fundamental and as total as the cold that had produced it. The second thing that radiated from the boot marks was char. The snow around the marks, for a radius of 3 feet, was not white but black, not dirty, not sooty, but charred, as though something had burned the snow itself, not the surface but the structure, the crystalline lattice of the ice broken and carbonized by a heat so intense and so focused that it had altered the chemistry of the frozen water, turning it from H2O into something else, something dark and brittle and wrong. "Mark!" Dr. Park shouted into the trees. His voice was swallowed by the wind. The trees were still, the branches bare, the trunks coated in ice that glittered in the gray light. There was no response. There was no sound. There was no Mark. They searched for 2 hours. They circled the tree line, calling his name, sweeping the area with flashlights, looking for any sign, a piece of clothing, a tool, a track, a blood trail. They found nothing. The snow beyond the tree line was pristine, unbroken, a white sheet that stretched to the horizon without variation. Mark had not walked into the trees. He had not been dragged. He had been standing at the edge of the tree line, and then he had been gone, and the only evidence that he had ever been there was a pair of boot marks, a trail of hot water, and a circle of charred snow. They went back to the station. They called Mark's radio. They called and called, static. They called the county sheriff's office on the satellite phone, static. They tried the satellite uplink down. The instrument tower, which Mark had been on his way to check, was not transmitting. The seismograph, which had been registering the rhythmic, low-frequency vibration, was not transmitting. The station was cut off, and Mark Davison was gone, and the only explanation was the boot marks and the hot water and the charred snow, and the word that Cale had spoken in the common room 3 days earlier. Chenoo. The offerings appeared on the 5th day. Charlie found them when he went out to replenish the propane supply from the external tank. The tank was on the north side of the station, connected to the main system by a reinforced fuel line that ran through a conduit in the concrete wall. The access panel was at ground level, and Charlie had to kneel in the snow to reach it, and when he knelt, he saw them. Piles of meat. 3 piles, arranged in a rough semicircle at the edge of the tree line, 30 feet from the station wall. The meat was frozen, hard, gray, coated in a layer of frost that made it look like stone, but it was unmistakably meat. Raw, red, frozen meat, stacked in portions that were too large to be from any animal that Charlie could identify, too cleanly cut to be the result of predation, and too deliberately placed to be anything other than an offering. But the meat was wrong. Charlie knelt beside the nearest pile and examined it with the careful, methodical attention that he brought to every geological specimen he had ever studied. The meat was muscle tissue, dense, fibrous, the grain running in the parallel striations that characterize skeletal muscle. But the size was wrong. The individual fibers were too large, 3 or 4 times the diameter of normal mammalian muscle fiber, visible to the naked eye as distinct, thread-like structures that ran the length of each piece. And the color was wrong. Not the dark red of beef or the pale pink of pork, but a deep, arterial red that was too uniform, too saturated, as though the blood had not drained from the tissue but had been retained, sealed inside the muscle, preserved. And the meat was warm. Not hot, not the burning, paradoxical heat of the water that had flowed from Mark's boot marks, but warm. Warm in a way that frozen meat should not be, warm in a way that defied the ambient temperature, warm in a way that suggested not residual heat but active heat, metabolic heat, the heat of tissue that was not dead but alive, that was not frozen but functioning, that was not meat but something else. Something that looked like meat and smelled like meat, and was arranged like an offering but was not meat, was not an offering, was not anything that belonged in the rational, measurable, explicable world that Charlie Hopper had spent his entire life building in his mind. "Don't touch it." Cale's voice came from behind him. Charlie hadn't heard him approach. The snow should have crunched under his boots, should have announced his presence, but Cale moved the way people who have grown up in the wilderness move, with a silence that is not stealth but habit, the habit of a body that has learned to exist in a landscape without disturbing it. "Don't touch it," Cale said again. "Don't touch the meat, don't smell the meat, don't look at the meat for longer than you have to, go back inside." "Cale, what is this?" "It's the Chenoo. This is what it does. It leaves food at the edge of your territory. It leaves food to draw you out, to make you curious, to make you come to the tree line, to make you stand where Mark stood." Charlie looked at the meat. He looked at the tree line. He looked at the boot marks that had been Mark's last impression in the snow, now drifted over, nearly invisible. And he understood not the Chenoo, not the mythology, not the folklore, but the pattern. The pattern of a predator that lures its prey, that uses curiosity and hunger, and the instinct to investigate as tools of the hunt, that leaves offerings not as gifts but as bait, that waits at the edge of the territory for the prey to come to it rather than expending the energy to go to the prey. He went back inside. He did not touch the meat. The creature attacked on the 6th night. The whiteout came first, a wall of driven snow that hit the station like a battering ram, the wind increasing from a gale to a hurricane in a matter of minutes, the visibility dropping from 100 yards to 0. The station shook. The windows flexed in their frames. The furnace cycled to full capacity, and the generator kicked in as the solar panels were buried, and the station became a bubble of warmth and light in a universe of cold and dark and noise. And then the noise stopped. The wind died, not gradually, instantly, as though someone had turned off a switch. 1 second the air was a screaming, howling, horizontal vortex of snow and ice. The next second it was still, perfectly, absolutely, impossibly still. The snow that had been driving horizontally hung in the air, suspended, the flakes motionless, as though the atmosphere itself had frozen, as though time had stopped. And in the stillness the heat came. Charlie felt it first, a warming of the air, a softening of the cold, a change so subtle and so gradual that it registered not in his conscious mind but in his body, in the millions of thermoreceptors in his skin that detected the shift from -32 to -30 to -25 to -20 to -15. The temperature rising, 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 as though something were approaching the station, something that radiated heat the way a furnace radiates heat, something that was warming the air around it with its mere presence. "The temperature is rising," Leslie said from the instrument console. Her voice was calm, professional, the voice of a meteorologist observing data. "It's risen 18 degrees in the last 2 minutes. That's not possible. That rate of change doesn't occur naturally." "It's not natural," Cale said. He was standing at the window, his face pressed to the glass, his breath fogging the pane, his eyes focused on something outside. "It's here." "Who's here?" Dr. Albright asked. "The Chenoo." And then the power went out. The generator died, the furnace stopped, the lights went dark. The station, which had been a bubble of warmth and light, became a tomb of cold and darkness, and the darkness was total, not the darkness of a power outage, which is relative, which is broken by starlight and moonlight and the ambient glow of a civilization that never fully sleeps, but an absolute darkness, the darkness of a whiteout at night, the darkness of a world in which the snow reflects nothing because there is nothing to reflect, the darkness of a universe that has been sealed. And in the darkness, the heat continued to rise. -10, 0, +5, +10. The temperature inside the station was rising, the cold air warming, the frost on the windows melting, the ice on the walls weeping, running, streaming, the station sweating, the station thawing, the station warming from the outside in as something approached, something massive and cold and hungry that radiated a heat so intense that it was melting the permafrost beneath the station's foundations. Charlie felt the heat through the floor. The concrete, 12 inches of reinforced concrete that had been frozen solid for months, was warm. Not room temperature warm. Warm. Actually, genuinely, physically warm, as though the ground beneath the station were a heating element, as though the bedrock itself were being heated by something below. Something that was below and approaching and radiating a heat that should have been impossible for a creature that was, by every account, frozen. "That's the paradox," Cale said. His voice came from the darkness, calm, steady, the voice of a man who had been expecting this and who had prepared for it the way one prepares for a flood or a fire, not with confidence but with acceptance. "The Chenoo is cold. Colder than anything. Its heart is ice, but its body radiates heat, blistering, unnatural heat. The cold inside it is so extreme that the differential between its internal temperature and the ambient air creates a thermal flow that manifests as heat on the outside. It's the same paradox that makes dry ice fog. The cold is so cold that it condenses the moisture out of the air, and the condensation looks like heat. But the Chenoo's cold is so extreme that it inverts the relationship. It doesn't condense the air, it ignites it. The heat you're feeling is the air itself burning, molecular friction, the atmospheric gases rubbing against the cold, generating heat from the friction of the collision between the temperature extremes." "That's not," Dr. Park started. "I know it's not science, I know it doesn't make sense, I know the thermodynamics don't work, but the Chenoo doesn't work by thermodynamics, it works by hunger. The hunger is the physics. The hunger is the thermodynamics. The hunger is the law." The heat was intense now. +15, +20. The station was warming from a freezer to a sauna, and the transition was not comfortable. It was suffocating, claustrophobic, the air thick and damp and heavy with moisture that was condensing on every surface, the walls running with water, the ceiling dripping, the floor a shallow lake of meltwater that was getting deeper by the minute. And from outside, from the wall of white, from the stillness, from the dark, came a sound. Not a roar, not a growl, not a scream. A sound that was lower than any of those, a sound that was below the range of human hearing but that was felt rather than heard, a vibration that traveled through the ground and the walls and the floor and the air and the bodies of the 7 people in the station, a vibration that was rhythmic, regular, biological. A heartbeat. The same heartbeat that Dr. Park had detected seismically. The same 0.3 Hz vibration that the seismograph had registered. The same lub-dub of a cardiac cycle that was so massive and so powerful that it shook the bedrock, that it was detectable through the granite, that it was in this moment in the dark, in the heat, in the melted water flood of the station, the loudest thing Charlie had ever heard. Not because it was loud, but because it was everything, because there was nothing else. Because the wind had stopped and the generator was dead and the furnace was off, and the only sound in the world was the heartbeat of the thing outside, the heartbeat of the Chenoo, the heartbeat of a creature whose heart was ice and whose hunger was eternal, and whose presence was turning the frozen research station into a warm, dark, flooded tomb. "What do we do?" Dana asked. Her voice was small, not the voice of a graduate student but the voice of a 27-year-old woman who was far from home and cold and scared, and who wanted, more than anything, for someone to tell her that everything was going to be okay. "We go to the basement," Cale said. "The storage area. It's the deepest part of the station. It's cut into the bedrock, the walls are 2 feet of concrete, and there's only one access point, a steel door with a deadbolt. We go there, we seal the door, and we wait." "Wait for what?" Charlie asked. "Wait for it to leave. The Chenoo is driven by hunger. It hunts when it's hungry and it rests when it's not. If we deny it access, if it can't reach us, if it can't eat us, the hunger will eventually drive it to find easier prey. It will leave. It will go back to the trees, to the wilderness, to the places where the silence and the cold are absolute and the hunger can sleep." "And if it doesn't leave?" Cale didn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer was in the heat, in the heartbeat, in the water that was rising around their ankles, and in the sound of something massive shifting its weight outside the station walls. They went to the basement. The basement of Station Zero was carved directly into the granite of the mountain. It had been designed as a storage area, a reinforced concrete chamber, 30 feet by 20 feet, with a ceiling height of 8 feet and a single access point. A steel door at the top of a short flight of concrete stairs, equipped with a deadbolt, a crash bar, and a manual lock that could be operated from inside. The walls were 2 feet of reinforced concrete backed by solid bedrock. The floor was concrete slab poured directly onto the granite. The ceiling was reinforced concrete, separating the basement from the ground floor of the station. It was, in every structural sense, a bunker. And in the current circumstances, no power, rising water, something enormous and hungry outside, it was the safest place available. They went down. 7 people: Charlie, Cale, Dr. Albright, Dr. Park, Leslie, Dana, and Ruth, descended the stairs, carrying what they could grab in the 30 seconds between Cale's decision and the sound of something striking the exterior wall of the station with a force that made the concrete crack. Charlie grabbed the emergency lamp, a battery-powered LED unit that threw a harsh, white, shadowless light. Cale grabbed the fire extinguisher. Dr. Albright grabbed her laptop, which contained the station's data logs. Dr. Park grabbed the first aid kit. Leslie grabbed the portable weather station. Dana grabbed blankets from the bunks. Ruth, who had been in the bathroom when the power went out, grabbed nothing and came down the stairs wet and shivering, and wearing only a thermal undershirt and pants. They sealed the door. The deadbolt slid home with a heavy, metallic chunk that was the most comforting sound Charlie had ever heard. The crash bar engaged. The manual lock turned. They were sealed in. The basement was cluttered. Shelving units lined the walls, loaded with the supplies that sustained the station through the winter. Canned goods, dehydrated rations, MREs, medical supplies, tool kits, spare parts for the generator and the furnace, and against the far wall, stacked in 50-pound bags on a pallet, the industrial road salt that was used to de-ice the winter access road. 250 pounds of sodium chloride. Charlie looked at the salt. He looked at Cale. Cale was standing by the door, his hand on the deadbolt, his head tilted, listening. The heartbeat was still audible, a low, rhythmic vibration that traveled through the bedrock and the concrete and the steel, a sound that was not a sound but a presence, a pulse, the biological rhythm of something enormous standing on the other side of the wall. "Tell us about the Chenoo," Charlie said. "Everything, not the folklore, the practical version. How does it hunt? How does it kill? How do you stop it?" Cale looked at him. In the harsh light of the emergency lamp, his face was all planes and angles, the shadows sharp, the features drawn, and his eyes dark, steady, the eyes of a man who has spent his life reading a landscape that most people never see, held something that Charlie had not seen before. Not fear, not resignation, calculation. The focused, deliberate calculation of a man who is solving a problem with the tools available, and the tools available are limited, and the problem is enormous. "The Chenoo is a former human," Cale said. A person whose hunger became so extreme, so absolute that the body underwent a transformation. The heart, the organ, the muscle crystallized. It turned to ice. Not metaphorically, literally. The tissue of the heart underwent a physical change, the proteins denaturing and recrystallizing as a form of biological ice, a structure that is harder than frozen water and colder than any natural temperature. The ice heart became the engine of the creature. It produces the cold, the extreme, impossible cold that radiates from the Chenoo's body, and it produces the hunger, the insatiable, eternal need to consume, to eat, to fill the void that the frozen heart has created. The cold and the hunger are linked, Dr. Albright said. She was sitting on a crate, her laptop open on her knees, her fingers poised over the keyboard, her silver hair coming loose from its bun. Her voice was the voice of a scientist who has been presented with a hypothesis and is testing it against the available data. The cold drives the hunger. The body needs fuel to maintain its internal temperature, but the ice heart prevents the body from retaining heat, so the hunger is never satisfied. And the hunger drives the cold. The more the creature eats, the larger the ice heart grows, the colder the creature becomes, the more it needs to eat. Yes, Kale said, that's the cycle. Cold produces hunger, hunger produces cold. The cycle has been running for, I don't know, centuries, maybe longer. The Chenoo I'm describing, the one in the stories, the one outside, that creature has been alive for a very long time. It has been eating for a very long time, and every meal makes the heart bigger and the cold worse and the hunger deeper. How do you kill it? Charlie asked. 2 ways, Kale said. The first is salt, sodium chloride. Salt dehydrates by osmosis. It draws water out of cells, disrupts the cellular membrane, crystallizes the intracellular fluid. If you can expose the ice heart to a sufficient quantity of salt, the salt will react with the frozen tissue and cause a catastrophic expansion. The ice will crystallize, fracture, and shatter from the inside. It's the same principle as salting a frozen sidewalk, but at a biological scale. We have 250 pounds of road salt, Charlie said. That might be enough, but you have to get the salt to the heart. The heart is inside the chest. You'd have to get the Chenoo to ingest it, or you'd have to apply it directly to an open wound that reaches the chest cavity. And the second way. Overfeeding. The cycle cold, hunger, cold, it has a limit. The heart can only grow so large before the body can no longer contain it. If you can force the Chenoo to consume more than its body can process, more fuel than the ice heart can freeze, the excess heat will overwhelm the heart's thermal regulation and the heart will be expelled, vomited out, purged. The creature will regurgitate its own heart. And then you destroy the heart, before the creature can reabsorb it, before the hunger can draw it back in. You take the heart and you shatter it and you burn the pieces and you scatter the ashes and the cycle ends. The silence that followed was the silence of 7 people processing a plan that sounded like mythology and recognizing, with varying degrees of reluctance and terror, that the mythology was the only plan they had. How do we lure it? Charlie asked. If we need it to ingest the salt or to eat enough to overfeed, we need it to come to us. We need to bring it into a space where we can control the interaction. Kale looked at the salt. He looked at the rations. He looked at the reinforced concrete walls and the steel door and the single, narrow access point. The storage locker, he said. He pointed to a section of the basement that was separated from the main area by a partition wall and a second steel door. That room is 12 by 8. Concrete walls, steel door, deadbolt. If we open the door, bait the room with food, enough food to trigger the hunger response, and hide the salt inside the food or mixed with the food, the Chenoo will enter the room to eat, and we can seal the door behind it. It'll tear through the door, Dr. Park said. Not immediately. The creature is strong, but it's not fast, not in a confined space. The heat it radiates will work against it. It takes time for the heat to soften steel. We'd have minutes, maybe 5, maybe 10. And in those 5 to 10 minutes, In those 5 to 10 minutes we feed it. We feed it salt. We feed it rations. We force the cycle to overload, and when the heart comes out, we destroy it. Who feeds it? Dana asked. Her voice was steady now, not calm, but controlled, the voice of someone who has moved past panic into the cold, functional territory that lies on the other side. Someone has to be in the room with it. Someone has to force-feed a monster that radiates enough heat to melt steel. I'll do it, Charlie said. No, Cale said. I'll do it. I know the creature. I know its patterns. I can anticipate its movements. Cale, you're the only one who knows how to navigate out of these mountains. If you die in that room, the rest of us are stranded. Charlie, I've been navigating these mountains since before you were born. If I die in that room, the mountain will show you the way. It always does. They argued. The argument was short and intense and resolved nothing, because the resolution was not in the argument but in the situation, and the situation was this. Something was outside, and it was hungry, and it was not going to leave, and the only way to survive was to kill it, and the only way to kill it was to feed it, and the only way to feed it was to be in the room with it when it ate. They prepared the kill box. They worked in the dark, by the light of the emergency lamp and 2 flashlights, moving with the focused, mechanical efficiency of people who have been given a task, and who are performing it because performing it is better than thinking about what happens if they fail. They cleared the storage locker, the shelves, the tools, the spare parts, and they lined the floor with the 50-pound bags of road salt, split open and spread in a thick white layer that covered every inch of the concrete. They stacked the rations, canned goods, dehydrated meals, MREs, on the far side of the room, arranged so that the Chenoo would have to step through the salt to reach the food. They mixed additional salt into the open ration packages, packing it into the MRE pouches, dusting it over the canned goods, dissolving it in the water from the melted snow that was still seeping under the basement door. They worked for 2 hours. The heartbeat outside never stopped. The Chenoo found them before they were ready. It came through the wall. Not through the door, through the wall. The reinforced concrete wall that separated the basement from the ground floor. 12 inches of steel-reinforced concrete that was rated for seismic events and blast loads. And the Chenoo came through it the way a man comes through a curtain, not by destroying it but by passing through it. The concrete crumbling and flowing and parting around the creature's body, as though the wall were not solid but liquid, as though the heat that the creature radiated had softened the concrete to the consistency of wet sand, and the creature had simply walked through it. The heat hit them first, a wall of thermal energy that was so intense it was physical, a blast of hot air that knocked Charlie off his feet and sent the emergency lamp spinning across the floor, and filled the basement with a shimmering, wavering distortion that was the air itself superheating, the molecules of nitrogen and oxygen accelerating to speeds that produced visible heat haze. The temperature in the basement, which had been rising slowly since the power went out, spiked, +20, +30, +40, the mercury climbing so fast that Leslie's portable weather station, which was sitting on a shelf, displayed the number in a rapid, flickering cascade that looked like a slot machine. And then the Chenoo was in the room. It was worse than Charlie had imagined, worse than the whiteout encounter, worse than the finger, the hand, the glimpse of gray skin and glowing eyes. In the confined space of the basement, with the emergency lamp throwing harsh, white light into every corner, the creature was fully visible, fully illuminated, and the detail was the kind of detail that the brain rejects, not because it is too horrible to process, but because it is too wrong, too impossible, too far outside the parameters of anything the brain has evolved to handle. The Chenoo was 9 feet tall. Its body was gaunt, emaciated in the way that only a creature that has been consuming itself for centuries can be emaciated, the bones visible through the remnants of muscle and skin, the ribs a cage of sharp, white ridges, the pelvis a jutting shelf, the spine a chain of knobs that pressed against the gray, translucent skin from the inside. The patches of remaining skin, on the shoulders, the thighs, the forearms, were not skin but remnants, fragments, strips of tissue that clung to the body like old bandages, and the fragments were covered in a fine, white frost that was not ice but crystallized fat. And the patches were gnawed. The edges of the remaining skin, where it met the exposed muscle and tendon beneath, were ragged, chewed, the marks of teeth that had bitten and torn at the creature's own flesh, the evidence of a hunger so extreme that the creature had been eating itself, consuming its own body in a futile attempt to satisfy the void in its chest. The eyes were the worst. Amber, glowing, incandescent, the irises burning with a heat that was visible as a shimmer in the air around the creature's head. And the intelligence in those eyes was not the cold, calculating intelligence of a predator, but the hot, desperate intelligence of a being that is aware of its own suffering and cannot stop it. A being that knows it is hungry and knows it will always be hungry and knows that the hunger is the only thing that defines it, and that the definition is a cage from which there is no escape. The Chenoo looked at them. It looked at each of them in turn. Dr. Albright, Dr. Park, Leslie, Dana, Ruth, Cale, Charlie. And its eyes lingered on each face with an attention that was not predatory but personal, as though it were memorizing them, as though it were seeing not food but individuals, as though the intelligence behind the hunger was capable of recognizing the humanity of its prey, and was choosing to eat them anyway, because the hunger was stronger than the recognition, because the hunger was stronger than everything. And then it moved. It moved toward the food. The rations, the canned goods, the MREs, stacked on the far side of the storage locker, arranged as bait, surrounded by the salt. The creature crossed the basement in 3 strides, 3 massive ground-shaking strides that cracked the concrete floor and sent the shelving units toppling. And it entered the storage locker, and its feet crunched on the salt, and the crunch was the sound of sodium chloride crystals being crushed beneath a weight that was impossible. And the salt hissed, the hiss of a chemical reaction, of salt meeting biological tissue, of the osmotic process beginning, the dehydration, the crystallization. "Now," Cale shouted. Charlie slammed the door. The steel door of the storage locker swung shut with a sound that was both mechanical and final, the chunk of the deadbolt, the click of the crash bar, the resonant, hollow boom of steel meeting steel. The Chenoo was inside. The salt was inside. The food was inside. And the 7 survivors were outside in the basement, pressed against the far wall, the heat from the storage locker already beginning to seep through the steel door in waves that were visible as shimmer in the air. The creature screamed. The scream was not sound. It was heat. A blast of thermal energy that hit the steel door and turned it orange, not red, not yellow, but orange, the orange of heated metal, the orange of a steel door being raised to a temperature that was softening it, warping it, turning a barrier into a membrane. The heat was so intense that Charlie could feel it through his clothes, through his skin, through his muscles and into his bones, and the bones ached with the heat, the deep, marrow-level ache of a body being warmed from the outside by a source that was not fire but hunger, not combustion but desperation. Inside the storage locker, the Chenoo was eating. They could hear it, the wet, tearing, chewing sounds of a creature consuming food with the speed and the desperation of a hunger that could not be satisfied, that would never be satisfied, that was eating not for pleasure or sustenance, but because eating was the only thing it knew how to do, the only activity that the frozen heart allowed, the only response to the void in its chest that was not silence but emptiness, not absence but need. It was eating the salt. It was eating the rations. It was eating everything, the canned goods, the MREs, the dehydrated meals, the road salt, the 50-pound bags of sodium chloride that had been split open and spread across the floor. It was eating all of it because the hunger did not distinguish between food and not food, between sustenance and poison, between the thing that would fill the void and the thing that would destroy it. The hunger was indiscriminate. The hunger ate everything. The steel door was warping. The top corner, where the heat was most concentrated, was bowing inward, the metal softening, the deadbolt straining against the warped frame. Charlie could see the metal changing color, from orange to a dull, cherry red, the color of steel approaching its yield point, the temperature at which the structural integrity of the metal begins to fail. "It's going to get out," Leslie said. Her voice was flat, the voice of someone stating a fact. "Not yet," Cale said. He was watching the door with the same focused, calculating expression he had worn since the beginning, and in his hands he held the fire extinguisher, a dry chemical unit, rated for Class B and C fires, containing a charge of sodium bicarbonate powder that was designed to smother flames by displacing oxygen and lowering the temperature. "Salt," Cale said. "The extinguisher contains sodium bicarbonate. It's a salt. A different salt, but a salt. If the door fails, if the creature breaks through, I'll hit it with the extinguisher. The powder will coat the creature's skin and the sodium will react with the ice heart. It won't kill it, but it might slow it down." Inside the locker, the eating sounds changed. The wet, tearing, chewing gave way to something else, a retching, a gagging, the sound of a body that is being forced to process more material than it can handle, the sound of a digestive system that is overloaded and is beginning to reject the load. The Chenoo was vomiting. Not vomiting in the way a human vomits, the gentle, reflexive, stomach-driven regurgitation of a body that has eaten something wrong, but vomiting in the way a volcano erupts, the entire body convulsing, the muscles of the torso and the chest, and the throat contracting in a massive, synchronized spasm that was driven not by the stomach, but by the heart, by the ice heart, by the frozen core that was reacting to the salt the way a block of ice reacts to a blowtorch. The convulsions intensified. The steel door was cherry red now, the metal sagging, the deadbolt bending. The heat was unbearable. The basement was an oven, a furnace, a kiln, and the 7 survivors were pressed against the far wall, their clothes steaming, their skin reddening, their bodies beginning to cook. "Charlie," Cale said, his voice was calm. "When the door goes, I need you to take the extinguisher and spray the creature. Aim for the chest. The powder will react with the heart. The reaction will be violent. The heart will be expelled. When it comes out, you take the sledgehammer from the tool shelf and you destroy it." "Cale." "Don't argue, I'll be at the door. I'll hold it as long as I can. You take the heart and you destroy it. That's the plan, that's the only plan." The door failed. It did not burst open. It did not explode. It melted. The steel, which had been softening for the last 3 minutes, reached its yield point and flowed. The top half of the door sagging and dripping and pouring like liquid, the deadbolt dissolving, the frame deforming, and through the gap, through the waterfall of molten steel, the Chenoo emerged. It was worse now. The salt had changed it. The skin that remained was blistered, bubbled, the tissue reacting to the sodium chloride with a violence that was visible and audible. The hiss and crack of dehydration, the pop of cells rupturing, the wet, tearing sound of tissue separating from bone. The creature's eyes were wild. Not the focused, calculating wildness of a predator, but the unfocused, desperate wildness of a thing in pain. A thing that is being destroyed from the inside, and is trying, with the last of its intelligence and its hunger, to consume the thing that is destroying it. It lunged for Cale. Cale was ready. He stepped to the side, not a dodge, not an evasion, but a precise, deliberate sidestep that put him at the creature's flank, and he raised the fire extinguisher and discharged it. The white powder, sodium bicarbonate, sodium chloride, a cloud of chemical salt, erupted from the nozzle in a blast that hit the Chenoo in the chest, and the reaction was instantaneous. The creature screamed. Not heat this time, sound. A sound that was beyond screaming, beyond vocalization, beyond any noise that a human throat could produce. A sound that came from the depths of the creature's chest, from the ice heart itself, from the frozen core that was being attacked by the salt, and the sound was the sound of ice breaking, of crystal shattering, of a structure that had been intact for centuries fracturing under a chemical assault that it was not designed to withstand. The Chenoo convulsed. Its body bent forward, the spine arching, the ribs spreading, the chest cavity opening. Not an anatomical opening, but a structural one. The tissue between the ribs splitting, the muscle tearing, the skin, what remained of it, shredding. And from the opening, from the chest cavity of the creature, a light emerged. Not light, cold. A cold so extreme that it was visible. A blue-white glow that was the opposite of the heat the creature radiated. A cold that was the true face of the Chenoo, the cold of the ice heart, and the heart was rising, being pushed upward, being expelled, being vomited from the chest cavity in a geyser of frozen blood and crystallized tissue, and the jagged, translucent shard of ice that was the heart, the engine, the source of the hunger and the cold and the centuries of suffering. The heart flew from the creature's chest and hit the basement floor with a sound like a crystal vase shattering, not the whole heart, but the impact cracked it, split it into 3 jagged pieces that skittered across the concrete, trailing a fog of supercooled vapor that flash froze everything it touched. The floor, the shelves, the air, the leg of Ruth's pants, the tips of Charlie's boots. Charlie grabbed the sledgehammer. The sledgehammer was on the tool shelf, 8 pounds of steel head on a fiberglass handle, the kind of tool used for demolition work. Charlie had used one before. He knew the weight, the balance, the way the head traveled through the arc of the swing. He grabbed it and he ran to the nearest piece of the heart, a shard of ice the size of a man's fist, translucent, jagged, pulsing with a blue-white internal glow that was the light of the hunger, the light of the cold, the light of a century of suffering compressed into a crystal of frozen blood and biological ice. He swung. The sledgehammer hit the shard and the shard exploded, not into fragments but into vapor, a cloud of sublimated ice that flashed from solid to gas in an instant, and the gas was cold, so cold that the air around it crystallized, the moisture in the atmosphere freezing into a cloud of diamonds that hung in the air for 1, 2, 3 seconds before settling to the floor like snow. The second shard, Charlie ran to it, swung, hit, another explosion of vapor, another cloud of diamonds. The third shard was in the creature's hand. The Chenoo had fallen. Its body, without the heart, was collapsing, not dying but deflating, the tissue losing its structure, the muscles going slack, the bones settling, the creature folding inward like a tent with its poles removed. But the hand, the right hand, the massive, skinless, gray-fleshed hand, had closed around the third shard of the heart, and the hand was moving it toward the chest cavity, toward the opening from which it had been expelled. And Charlie understood with a cold, terrible clarity that the creature was trying to reabsorb the heart, to put it back, to restart the cycle, to continue the hunger. Charlie brought the sledgehammer down on the creature's hand. The sound was the sound of bone breaking and ice shattering simultaneously, a wet, crunching, splintering sound that was both biological and crystalline, and the hand released the shard, and Charlie grabbed it. It was cold, so cold that it burned, so cold that his fingers went white and numb in the instant of contact, and he placed it on the floor and he swung the sledgehammer and the shard exploded, and the vapor rose and the cold washed over him and the hunger that had been a presence, a pressure, a thing in the air and the walls and the floor and the heat. The hunger was gone. The Chenoo collapsed. Not slowly, not in stages, all at once. The body, 9 feet of emaciated, gray-fleshed, self-cannibalized, salt-burned, heartless flesh, fell to the floor of the basement like a puppet with its strings cut, and the fall was heavy, final, the sound of dead weight hitting concrete, and the creature did not move, and the heat, which had been building, which had been softening steel, which had been cooking the survivors, vanished. The vanishing was not gradual, it was instantaneous. One moment the basement was an oven, +40, +50, the air shimmering, the walls sweating, the survivors steaming. The next moment the cold came back, all of it. The cold that the Chenoo had been absorbing, stealing, radiating away. The cold returned in a flash freeze that hit the basement like a wave, the temperature dropping from +50 to -32 in less than a second, and the moisture in the air. Every drop of condensation, every bead of sweat, every molecule of water that had been liberated by the heat crystallized. Instantly, completely. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, the shelves, the tools, the survivors' clothes, their hair, their eyelashes. Everything was coated in a layer of ice so fine and so uniform that it looked like frost. And the frost was the Chenoo's last breath, the last expression of the cold that had defined it, the cold that had been its heart and its hunger and its identity, released in a single, final, crystalline exhalation. The Chenoo's remains froze. The tissue, which had been warm and wet and functional, flash froze into a solid mass of gray ice that was not flesh but stone, biological permafrost, tissue that had been frozen so completely and so rapidly that it had crystallized at the molecular level, becoming not a body but a sculpture, a permanent, frozen monument to the hunger that had driven it, and the cold that had defined it, and the salt that had destroyed it. Charlie stood over the frozen remains, the sledgehammer in his hands, his breath crystallizing in the air, his skin steaming where the residual heat of the creature's presence was still dissipating. He was alive. He was cold. He was not hungry. He was not hungry because the hunger was gone. The hunger that had been in the air, in the heat, in the heartbeat, in the very atmosphere of the station. That hunger was gone, destroyed, shattered, scattered in 3 clouds of sublimated ice that were settling to the floor like the finest snow, like the dust of something that had once been alive and was now, finally, permanently, irrevocably dead. The silence that followed the death of the Chenoo was the loudest thing Charlie Hopper had ever heard. It was not the silence of absence, the silence of a room without sound, a forest without wind. It was the silence of cessation, the silence of something that had been making noise for a very long time suddenly and permanently stopping. The heartbeat, the 0.3 hertz vibration that had been shaking the bedrock, that had been detectable through the seismograph, that had been the biological rhythm of a creature whose heart was ice, was gone. The heat, the blistering, paradoxical, impossible heat that had been melting the station's foundations, was gone. The hunger, the pressure, the pull, the inward gravity that had been a presence in the air and the walls and the floor, was gone. The basement was cold, the basement was dark, the basement was silent. And in the cold and the dark and the silence, 7 people stood in a frozen room surrounded by the crystallized remains of something that had been a man and had become a monster and was now a statue. And they breathed, and their breath crystallized in the air. And the crystallization was the most beautiful thing Charlie had ever seen because it was the evidence that the air was cold and clean and free of the heat, and the hunger and the thing that had made them. "Is it dead?" Dana asked. Her voice was small in the silence, a human sound in an inhuman space, and the smallness was not weakness but survival, the sound of a person who is still alive and is checking to make sure that the world is still the kind of world in which being alive is possible. "It's dead," Cale said. He was standing beside the frozen remains, his hand resting on the ice that encased the creature's shoulder, and his touch left no mark. The ice was too hard, too cold, too permanent. The ice was the Chenoo's monument and its coffin and its grave, all 3, and it would last, Cale knew, for as long as the cold lasted, which in this basement, cut into the granite, sealed in permafrost, could be decades, centuries. The Chenoo would remain here, frozen, permanent, a warning and a record, and a testament to the hunger that had been and was no more. "We need to get out of here," Dr. Albright said. Her voice was steady, the scientist's voice, the voice of a woman who has processed the data and arrived at a conclusion and is now executing the next logical step. "The station is compromised. The walls are damaged. The heating system is down. We need to evacuate." "The helicopter," Leslie started. "The helicopter can't fly in this weather, but the weather will break. The vortex is weakening. I can see it on the portable station. The pressure is rising. The wind is dropping. By tomorrow, the temperature will be warm enough for a rescue flight." "Tomorrow," Dr. Park said. "We survive tonight and tomorrow they come for us." "We survived tonight," Dr. Albright confirmed. They went upstairs. The ground floor of the station was a ruin. The walls cracked, the windows shattered, the furniture overturned, the floor flooded with meltwater that had already begun to refreeze, the surface skimming over with a thin, brittle sheet of ice that crackled under their boots. The propane furnace was dead. The fuel line had been severed when the Chenoo came through the wall. The generator was dead. The diesel had been contaminated by the meltwater. The only heat source remaining was the wood stove in the common room, and the only fuel remaining was the furniture and the wood paneling, and the emergency supply of firewood that was stored in a closet in the back hall. They built a fire. They burned the chairs, the tables, the shelves. They burned the wood paneling from the walls. They burned everything that would burn, and the fire was small and the heat was local and the cold pressed in from every side. But they were alive and they were together, and the fire was warm and the warmth was enough. They huddled around the fire. 7 people, wrapped in blankets, pressed close together, sharing body heat, sharing the fire, sharing the silence. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The experience had been beyond language, beyond communication, beyond the capacity of human speech to convey what they had seen and felt and done. They had watched a man become a monster, become a statue. They had fed a creature salt until its heart exploded. They had destroyed a thing that had been alive for centuries with a sledgehammer and a fire extinguisher and 250 pounds of road salt. And they had survived. Cale sat apart from the group near the window. The window was broken. The glass had been shattered by the heat and the opening was stuffed with blankets to keep the cold out. But a gap remained, and through the gap Cale watched the night. The snow had stopped. The wind had died. The sky was clearing, and through the thinning clouds the stars were appearing. Bright, cold, distant. The light of suns that had been burning for billions of years, and that would burn for billions more. Indifferent to the suffering of the creatures that lived and died on the small, warm, fragile planet that orbited them. "The Chenoo is not unique," Cale said. The others turned to look at him. The stories, the oral traditions, the legends, the accounts, they describe more than one. The Chenoo is a process, not a person. Any human being under the right conditions, extreme cold, extreme hunger, extreme isolation, can undergo the transformation. The heart freezes. The hunger begins. The cycle starts. "You're saying there are more of them?" Charlie asked. "I'm saying the conditions that create them exist wherever the cold is extreme enough and the hunger is deep enough. This one, the one we killed, it had been alive for centuries. But the process is ongoing. Somewhere in the cold places, in the places where the winter is long and the food is scarce and the silence is deep, someone is hungry, and the hunger is growing, and the heart is getting colder." The fire crackled. The stars burned. The night was cold and getting colder, and in the morning the helicopters would come, and the survivors would be taken to warm rooms and hot food and clean beds and the world of people and noise and civilization. And the Chenoo would remain in the basement, frozen, permanent, a statue of ice and hunger and suffering that would last as long as the cold lasted. But the cold, Cale knew, would last forever. The cold was not a condition. The cold was a force. The cold was the thing that waited at the end of every winter, at the bottom of every thermometer, in the heart of every hungry thing that had ever lived and would ever live. The cold was patient. The cold was eternal. And the cold was hungry. The helicopters arrived at dawn. The rescue team, 2 HH-60 Pave Hawk helicopters from the Maine Army National Guard, dispatched in response to the station's emergency beacon, which had been activated automatically when the power failed, landed on the ridge above the station at 7:14 a.m. The weather had broken overnight, the polar vortex retreating north, the temperature rising from -32 to a relatively balmy -8, and the sky was a clear, crystalline blue that made the snow-covered landscape look like a photograph, sharp and bright and still. Charlie was the last to leave the station. He walked through the ruined ground floor, past the broken walls and the shattered windows and the empty spaces where the furniture had been, past the closet where the firewood had been stored, past the door to the basement stairs that led down to the room where the Chenoo lay frozen in its permanent, crystalline sleep. He stopped at the top of the stairs. He looked down. The basement was dark. The emergency lamp had died hours ago, and the only light came from the flashlight in his hand, which threw a single, narrow beam into the darkness below. The beam found the ice that coated the walls, the floor, the ceiling, the shelves, and the shape that lay at the center of the room, the shape that was not a body but a sculpture, the shape that had been a man and had become a monster, and was now a thing of ice and silence and permanent, frozen hunger. Charlie looked at the shape for a long time. He looked at it the way a person looks at a grave, with respect, with sorrow, with the particular kind of grief that comes not from the loss of a person, but from the loss of the person's humanity. The recognition that the thing in the basement had once been a human being who had been hungry and cold and alone, and had undergone a transformation that was not a choice but a consequence. And the consequence had been centuries of suffering, and the suffering had been ended by a sledgehammer and a fire extinguisher and 250 pounds of road salt. He closed the door. He walked outside. He climbed into the helicopter. The rotor blades were turning, the downwash flattening the snow, and the noise, the mechanical, human, familiar noise of a gas turbine engine, was the most welcome sound he had ever heard. The helicopter lifted off. Charlie looked out the window. The station shrank beneath him, a gray, rectangular shape on the granite flank of the mountain, surrounded by snow, small and fragile and human. The mountain rose above it, dark and massive and indifferent, and the forest stretched away in every direction, a white, unbroken expanse that reached to the horizon, featureless and cold and silent. And as the helicopter banked south, as the station disappeared behind the ridge, as the mountain and the forest and the silence fell away beneath the noise and the speed and the warmth of the aircraft, Charlie looked down at the snow. The snow was unbroken, white, pristine, stretching in every direction, an endless white sheet that covered the world and hid whatever lay beneath it. And in the snow, far below, barely visible from the altitude of the helicopter, Charlie saw a single, steaming footprint. The footprint was not his. It was not the helicopter's. It was not the rescue team's. It was a footprint in the snow, a single impression, and the impression was steaming, a wisp of vapor rising from the indentation, the heat of the thing that had made it melting the snow around the edges, and the shape of the print was not a boot but a foot, a bare foot, a human foot. And the foot was large, too large, the toes too long, the heel too wide, and the steam was rising and the snow was melting and the footprint was there, in the snow, far from the station, far from the helicopter, far from everything, and the footprint was not the footprint of the Chenoo they had killed. It was the footprint of something else. Something that was hungry, something that was cold, something that was walking alone through the snow, through the silence, through the endless, frozen, patient landscape that was the winter, and the winter was deep, and the winter was long, and the winter was not over. The helicopter flew south. The footprint remained, the steam rose, the snow melted. And in the forest, in the silence, in the cold, something walked. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.